Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you used this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Polaris Station. Chapter 1. Patient Zero of the Network. Elias Vance loved the silence of the server room. Not that dead, vacuum-like silence of absolute nothingness, but a working silence filled with the barely audible hum of hundreds of cooling fans, the monotonous rustle of magnetic tapes in the automated backup library streamers, and the distant, almost infrasonic rumble of diesel generators, always ready to take over the power supply of Polaris Station. This silence was, to him, the music of order, a symphony of a functioning system that he, Elias, had designed, configured, and now meticulously maintained. The Polaris Station Logistics Center, frozen into the rocky tundra of an unnamed island in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, was a marvel of engineering and the pinnacle of automation. Tens of kilometers of conveyor belts, rows of gigantic shelving units disappearing into the darkness under the warehouse roof, the size of several football fields, and an army of silent robotic loaders, all controlled from a small operations center where Elias spent most of his 12-hour shifts. There were minimal personnel here, him, a few technicians for mechanical systems maintenance, and a security shift led by the perpetually grim Lieutenant Cole. No more were needed. Polaris was a self-sufficient organism, a steel heart pumping Arctic supplies to remote military posts and scientific stations. Elias leaned back in his ergonomic chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The monitors in front of him glowed steadily, displaying network diagrams, channel load graphs, server statuses, all in the green zone. Normal. He was about to run another diagnostic cycle before handing over to his replacement, who arrived on a cargo icebreaker once every 3 months, when suddenly a line in the system monitoring log caught his attention. 2024 to 315.217.31 INFO. New device detected. IP 192.168.100.254. Attempting connection to CRVR_MAIN via port 16. Elias frowned. The IP address 192.168.100.254 didn't belong to any device he knew of in Polaris' closed industrial network. The 100 range was reserved for the controllers of the robotic stacker cranes, and all addresses were statically assigned and documented by him personally. And 254, that address simply didn't exist in his scheme. It was like an empty apartment in a fully occupied building. But even stranger was port 16. CRVR_MAIN, the main server, physically had 15 active Ethernet ports, each with its own task, each under strict firewall and access policy control. A 16th port didn't exist, neither physically nor virtually. There was no such jack on the patch panel, no such configuration in the server's operating system settings. His first thought, a log parsing error. A glitch in the monitoring script. It happened, especially after the recent firmware update on some switches. Elias opened the console, typed a command for a direct query of active connections to CRVR_MAIN. The system's response was concise and baffling. Tap 00CRVR_MAN 16192.160.100.254.49,152 East Abulashid. Connection established. To a non-existent port. From a non-existent IP address. Internal test script, Elias decided, trying to maintain an analytical mindset. One of the system core developers left a backdoor for debugging and forgot to remove it. Or it's some new self-diagnostic module they forgot to add to the documentation. He felt a slight irritation. Such negligence at a facility of this level was unacceptable. He tried to forcibly terminate the connection. The pill command executed normally. The line in the connection list disappeared. Elias nodded with satisfaction. Now he would find which process had spawned this phantom connection and send an angry email to the developers. But 10 seconds later, the monitoring log peeped again. 2024 to 315.219.05 INFO. New device detected. IP 172.1630.128. Attempting connection to CRVR_MAI via port 16. A new IP from a completely different, though also internal, network range belonging to the climate control system, and again port 16. Elias felt a chill run down his spine, unrelated to the Arctic climate outside. This no longer looked like a forgotten script. He terminated the connection again. It reappeared 15 seconds later, this time from the IP address of one of the conveyor belt controllers in Sector Gamma 7. Methodically, one by one, he blocked these IP addresses on the firewall. But the Phantom simply changed its guise, each time choosing a new legitimate address from the internal network and persistently knocking on the non-existent 16th port. It was like a game of whack-a-mole, only instead of a plush toy, it was a persistent digital ghost. An hour later, having tried all standard isolation and blocking methods, Elias gave up. Port 16 remained active, and now the source IP address changed every few minutes, jumping from one network node to another, as if mocking his efforts. He decided to analyze the traffic passing through this anomalous connection. He launched a packet analyzer, setting a filter for port 16. At first, nothing. Empty packets, keep alive signals without any content. Elias was beginning to think it was some sophisticated error at the link layer that he just couldn't catch. And then it began. From the speakers of his workstation, usually silent unless there was a system alert, came a quiet, intermittent noise, as if someone was breathing very close to a microphone. Deep, slow inhales and exhales with a slight wheeze. Elias froze. The sound was coming from the traffic analyzer. Port 16 was transmitting audio. He checked his headset microphone, off. He scanned the room, no one. The surveillance cameras on the walls stared at him impassively. The breathing continued for about a minute, rhythmic, almost lulling, if not for its absolute inappropriateness and impossibility. Then it stopped and silence fell. Elias involuntarily held his breath listening. And then the speakers came alive again. But this time it wasn't noise. It was a voice. His own voice. Check sensor calibration on Delta line. Repeat, sensor calibration, Delta line. Finishing report by 1700 hours. It was a phrase he had spoken over the internal comms about 3 hours ago, reporting the completion of scheduled work. The recording was clear, without interference. But he hadn't made it. And he certainly hadn't broadcast it anywhere, especially not through some mystical port. The chill he had felt earlier now became almost palpable. This no longer resembled a technical malfunction. This was something else. Something alien, incomprehensible, and, apparently, possessing access to his actions and his voice. Elias Vance, a man of logic and systems analysis, felt the familiar, orderly world around him begin to crack. And through these cracks, something was peering out, something for which there was simply no place in his meticulously constructed picture of reality. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Wires. Elias spent the next few hours in a feverish state. He disconnected the speakers, but the thought that his words could be recorded and replayed at any moment gave him no peace. He rebooted CRVR_MAI several times, hoping it would reset the anomalous state. Port 16 would disappear during boot up, but invariably reappeared as soon as the system was fully operational. He reviewed all security logs, all system journals for the past few months. No traces of unauthorized external access. The Polaris station network was isolated from the mainland by a thick layer of firewalls, VPN gateways, and intrusion detection systems. Penetrating it from the outside was an almost impossible task, even for a well-prepared hacker group. And such a strange, almost poltergeist-like effect. A past failure on the Argos Industrial project surfaced in his memory with unpleasant persistence. Back then, the production control system had suffered a massive failure, leading to the shutdown of an entire factory. Officially, he wasn't blamed. It was attributed to a confluence of circumstances and an error in third-party software. But Elias knew he had missed something, some minor detail, some potential vulnerability in the architecture he himself had designed. That knowledge gnawed at him, undermining his confidence. Maybe he was missing something now too. Maybe this was the result of his own error, so deep and unobvious that he couldn't recognize it. He tried to physically trace the source. If the Phantom was using the IP addresses of real devices, perhaps one of them had some non-standard transmitter. He descended into the cold, echoing halls of the warehouse, where rows of shelving units were lost in the semi-darkness. Robotic loaders glided silently along their magnetic guide paths, their blue indicator lights casting dancing shadows on the concrete floor. Choosing a moment when Port 16 was sitting on the IP address of one of the stacker crane controllers in Sector Beta 4, Elias approached the massive machine. Its huge yellow manipulator arm was frozen, awaiting a command. Elias opened the controller's service panel. Bundles of wires, circuit boards, indicators, nothing unusual. No extra devices, no signs of tampering. He even scanned the airwaves with a portable spectrum analyzer, silence, apart from the background radiation from powerful electric motors and Wi-Fi access points for the technician's service tablets. Returning to the operations center, he saw that Port 16 had already moved to a temperature sensor in the server block's ventilation system. Pointless. This entity, or whatever it was, possessed the ability to emulate its presence on any network node without having a physical embodiment. It was nearing time for his shift change. Elias felt drained. His head throbbed from tension and lack of sleep. He had to write a report. But what would he write? Poltergeist detected in the network, connecting to a non-existent port and broadcasting my breathing. They'd sent him for a psychological evaluation on the next flight out. He decided not to mention the voice and the breathing for now. In the report, he dryly noted unstable network segment behavior related to an unidentified device sporadically appearing on the network under various IP addresses and attempting to establish a connection with an unconfigured port on CDRVER_MAIN. Localization and resolution efforts are underway. It sounded technical enough and not too insane. When Lieutenant Marcus Cole, head of security and currently the senior officer on site, entered the operations center, Elias flinched almost imperceptibly. Cole was an old-school type, a former Marine, with a face weathered by polar winds and a gaze that boded ill for rule breakers. "All quiet, Vance?" His voice was low, rumbling, like an icebreaker's engine. "Generally, yes, Lieutenant." Elias tried to keep his voice steady. "There's a minor network anomaly, but I'm working on it." Cole came closer, looked over Elias's shoulder at the screen with the logs. "Anomaly? This is no place for anomalies, Vance. Everything here is supposed to run like clockwork, especially your domain." "I understand, sir. It's probably a residual effect from the recent update. I'm almost sure it's a software glitch." Elias was lying, and it made him feel even worse. Cole grunted. "Have it fixed by morning. The last thing we need is some robot going haywire and scattering crates of canned stew all over the Arctic because of your software glitches." He clapped Elias on the shoulder a little harder than a friendly gesture required and left. Left alone, Elias turned the traffic analyzer back on for Port 16. Silence. No breathing, no voice. Only infrequent data packets zipping back and forth. But now they weren't empty. They contained short, fragmented strings of characters, a meaningless jumble of letters, numbers, and punctuation marks. A 3F8_6% and Cullup 001X's, breath, ses. Locate_Viancy_ECKO_SEQ. The last line made Elias's heart skip a beat. Locate_VANC. Echo sequence. This was no longer passive observation. This looked like a query, a command. And it was addressed to him, or at least concerned him. Elias quickly saved the logs and shut down the analyzer. He felt like a cornered animal. The unknown entity in his network didn't just exist. It was showing an interest in him. And he had no idea what that meant or what to expect from it. He left the operations center and walked down the long, dimly lit corridor of the residential block. His small, spartanly furnished room was cold, despite the working heater. He lay down on his bunk without undressing and stared at the ceiling. The silence was oppressive. Every rustle, every creak of the building, every distant hum of machinery seemed like a harbinger of something. Sleep wouldn't come. The lines from the log floated before his eyes, and the whisper of his own stolen and replayed voice still echoed in his ears. Suddenly, through the wall, in the adjacent empty room, a quiet, rhythmic tapping sounded. Tap, 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 as if someone was methodically tapping out Morse code with their knuckles. Elias froze. Besides him and Cole, there was no one else in this wing of the residential block. The technicians lived in a different section. The tapping repeated. Tap, 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 tap. He sat up sharply on the bunk. The tapping stopped. Paranoia? Auditory hallucinations from overwork? He desperately wanted to believe that. But when he lay down again and the silence thickened, he heard it again. This time, a quiet, barely audible whisper, seeming to come directly from the wall. Indecipherable words, like a distorted radio broadcast, mixed with the same breathing he had heard from port 16. Elias covered his ears with his hands. This couldn't be happening. The network was one thing, but for it to penetrate walls, he realized that the boundary between digital nightmare and physical reality was becoming dangerously thin, and he was right on that boundary. Chapter 3: Patterns in Chaos. The next few days became a living hell for Elias. He barely slept, sustaining himself on lighters of strong coffee and a single thought: find a logical explanation. He had to find one. His analytical mind, accustomed to order and the predictability of systems, desperately clung to this hope like a drowning man to a straw. Port 16 continued its ghostly existence in the Polaris station network. Elias stopped trying to disable it. It was useless. Instead, he focused on observation and data collection. He wrote several scripts that logged all activity related to the anomalous port around the clock: connection times, source IP addresses, content of transmitted packets, any audio signals. The noise patterns, which he had initially mistaken for simple breathing, became increasingly complex. Sometimes they were low-frequency hums that made the furniture in the operations center vibrate. Sometimes a high-pitched whistle that cut into his ears. Elias noticed that the intensity and nature of these sounds changed. He began to correlate them with external factors, and the first pattern emerged. The activity of port 16, especially the intensity of the audio signals, clearly correlated with the passage of certain military communication satellites and signals intelligence satellites over Polaris Station. He found publicly available charts of their orbits, and each time one of the interesting satellites was in direct line of sight, port 16 seemed to come alive, and the data it transmitted became more structured, though still undecipherable, as if it were trying to catch or amplify some signal from outside. The second pattern was related to geomagnetic activity. On days when the monitoring station at Owlet Bay reported strong disturbances in Earth's magnetosphere caused by solar flares, port 16 began to broadcast particularly strange things. It was no longer just noise or his voice. It was fragments of radio communications in different languages: English, Russian, Chinese, distorted, mixed with crackling and howling, as if caught on a very old and poor receiver. Sometimes fragments of music slipped through, sometimes unsettling symphonic passages, sometimes strange, dissonant electronic melodies. It's using our network infrastructure as a giant antenna, Elias thought. The idea was as terrifying as it was logical in its insane internal consistency. If this was some external signal or an entity trying to break through, then the complex, extensive, and well-shielded network of Polaris Station could serve as an ideal resonator for it. Port 16 no longer repeated his own words, but it started doing something worse. One morning, as Elias, staggering with fatigue, was brewing himself another cup of coffee, a quiet female voice emanated from his work terminal, which he had left on with the analyzer running, reciting random numbers with mechanical precision. And then, a children's counting rhyme in a language unknown to him. Elias nearly dropped his mug. He was sure no one could have accessed his terminal. The passwords were complex, two-factor authentication was enabled. But the most alarming thing was that port 16 began to affect the base's physical systems. At first, it was minor things. Lights flickering in the corridors, synchronous with the low-frequency hum from the speakers. Sector doors, which were supposed to open with his access card, sometimes jammed, and sometimes, on the contrary, swung open by themselves as he passed by. Then the robotic loaders rebelled. One day, walking through the Delta Sector warehouse, he saw one of the massive automatons veer off its magnetic line and move slowly towards the wall until it bumped into it with a quiet scrape. Its optical sensors, usually aimed at cargo or the route, were turned directly at Elias. He froze, watching. The robot stood like that for a minute, then its indicators blinked, and it just as slowly returned to its trajectory, as if nothing had happened. In the controller logs for that robot, Elias found a strange sequence of commands, supposedly received from CRVL_MAIN, but via the same IP address that port 16 was using at that moment. The commands were disguised as standard telemetry requests, but contained a hidden payload that had obviously caused the abnormal behavior. Elias realized he could no longer remain silent. This was going beyond a simple network anomaly. It was becoming dangerous. He cornered Lieutenant Cole in the mess hall during a short break. Cole, as always, was consuming his meager army lunch with the air of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Lieutenant, we need to talk seriously about the network problems," Elias began, trying to make his voice sound as convincing as possible. Cole looked up from his food, fixing Elias with a heavy gaze. "I thought you'd fixed all that, Vance. Or are your software glitches progressing?" Elias sighed. "It's not just a software glitch, it's something different. It's affecting the equipment. A robot in Delta Sector acted erratically this morning. I found traces of outside interference in its control system, coming from the same source I mentioned." "Outside interference," Cole smacked. "Vance, we're on a godforsaken island in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Where would outside interference come from? Russian submarine hackers? Polar bears with laptops?" "I don't know where." Elias felt a wave of despair at this impenetrable skepticism. "But it's there, and it's using our network. It's broadcasting strange signals." Yet he faltered, hesitant to mention the voices and breathing. "Signals?" Cole raised an eyebrow. "Vance, this place is always full of signals. Atmospheric interference, ionospheric reflections, satellites spying on each other. Our equipment sometimes goes haywire from all this electromagnetic junk. Recently, the radio in the ATV started picking up some Chinese opera on its own. The tech spent half a day fiddling with it. Normal for the Arctic. This isn't that." Elias raised his voice, then caught himself and continued more quietly. "This isn't interference. This is something targeted. It's trying to interact, and it's getting more active." Cole finished his portion, neatly stacking his utensils. "You know, Vance, up here, people sometimes lose it. Isolation, polar night, monotony. I've seen all sorts. Maybe you should take a couple of days off. Rest, get some air. Go down to the shore, look at the seals. They say it helps." Elias realized the conversation was over. Cole didn't believe him. Worse, he considered him either incompetent or going off the rails. The isolation Cole spoke of, Elias now felt it in its entirety. He was alone with this problem. Returning to his operations center, he sat down at the terminal. Several new entries had appeared in Port 16's activity log during his absence. Among them was one that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a string of characters or an audio file. It was an image. Small, black and white, very low resolution. It was composed of pixels, like a screenshot from a very old surveillance camera. The image showed a corner of some room, cluttered with equipment, and part of a human figure sitting at a table with its back to the camera. Elias enlarged the picture. The details were blurry, but he recognized the outline of the chair, his chair, and the contours of his own back, hunched over the keyboard. The picture had been taken by the surveillance camera mounted in the corner of the operations center. But he was sure that at the moment this picture could have been taken, judging by his posture, it was last night. He hadn't activated any functions related to transmitting images via port 16, and the port itself, in theory, shouldn't have had access to the video surveillance system. The entity in the network wasn't just observing him, it was showing him that it could see him. And then Elias noticed another detail in this grainy image. On the wall behind him, where a regular calendar hung, something else was visible in the picture. Some symbols, scratched or drawn directly over the image of an iceberg. The symbols were indistinct, but Elias recognized one of them. He had seen it before, in those meaningless strings that Port 16 had transmitted in the early days. A spiral with a dot in the center. Panic began to give way to cold, analytical fury. If this thing was playing with him, he would play with it. He had to understand the rules of this game. He opened his detailed observation log, which had now grown to several dozen pages. He began to review all the data again, all the patterns, all the strange messages, trying to find some system in this chaos. Several hours later, as the pale Arctic dawn was breaking outside the porthole, Ilias made his first real discovery. The strings of symbols, which he had considered gibberish, were not random. Some of them repeated, and the sequence of their appearance seemed to be related not only to external signals, but also to his own actions. When he rebooted certain servers, one group of symbols appeared. When he tried to block an IP address, another. It was some kind of language. Distorted, primitive, but a language. And Port 16 was trying to speak it. Or even more terrifyingly, it was trying to teach Ilias this language. Chapter 4. The Rosetta Stone of Darkness. The discovery that the seemingly chaotic symbols might be a form of communication both exhilarated Ilias and filled him with a chilling dread. It was one thing to deal with an impersonal system error, however strange. It was quite another to realize that on the other side of the digital barrier was something attempting to make contact using a language he now had to decipher. He transformed his operations center into a kind of linguistic laboratory. Printouts of logs with repeating symbol sequences highlighted covered tables and walls. He created a database entering every utterance from Port 16, correlating it with network events, sensor readings, time of day, phases of the moon. He'd started checking that too, abandoning all skepticism. And most disturbingly, his own actions and even, it seemed, his emotional state. He noticed that certain combinations of symbols, especially those including the spiral with a dot, or similar variations, often appeared before Port 16 began transmitting particularly intense audio signals or attempting to access new systems. Another sequence, resembling a distorted sine wave, ////, often preceded the playback of his voice or other captured sounds. One day, after a particularly rough night when a blizzard raged outside and Port 16 almost continuously broadcast a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate his bones, Ilias muttered aloud in desperation, "What do you want?" A few seconds later, a new line appeared on his monitor in the traffic analyzer window, less than WNTVANCECLARITY greater than. Ilias froze. This was no longer a mere coincidence. This was a response. Primitive, crude, but a response. Clarity. Did it want clarity? Or was it asking if he, Vance, wanted clarity? He cautiously typed the simple word hello on his keyboard and sent it via the command line, emulating a data packet to Port 16. The system wasn't designed for this kind of communication, but he'd found a way to encapsulate a text message into data the port could accept. The reply came almost instantly. VNC. Say, again. Ilias felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was learning. Or it already knew English at some basic level and was now trying to map it to its language of symbols. He spent the next few hours sending simple words and phrases and receiving combinations of symbols and sometimes garbled English words in return. It was like trying to communicate with an alien or an ancient deity through a damaged telegraph. The breakthrough came when he discovered that some symbols seemed to correspond to specific states of polarization systems. For example, a symbol resembling a trident appeared when the base's powerful radar installations, scanning the horizon, were activated. A symbol resembling an eye often accompanied data packets related to the video surveillance system. But there was one group of symbols that sent a particular shiver down Ilias's spine. They were complex, multi-part, and appeared rarely, usually during moments of maximum geomagnetic activity or when a specific, very old, and rumored to be long decommissioned military satellite, ARC-3, passed overhead. These symbols didn't correlate with anything inside the base. They felt alien, like something from far away. Ilias secretly dubbed them cosmic script. The physical manifestations of the anomaly didn't stop either. On the contrary, they became more sophisticated. One day, the fire suppression system in an empty warehouse block activated for no reason, flooding rows of empty shelves with foam. The logs showed no sensor errors. Only another strange command sent via Port 16. Lieutenant Cole was growing increasingly suspicious. He'd caught Elias at his linguistic research several times, seen the printouts with incomprehensible symbols. When asked directly what he was doing, Elias answered evasively, citing attempts to understand the deep structure of interference. Cole didn't believe him, but hadn't intervened directly yet, though his stares grew heavier. Elias knew he needed more information. He began digging into Polaris Station's archives. Most of the documentation was technical, concerning equipment and protocols. But in the furthest corner of the digital archive, in a folder marked for official use only, Access Level 4, he found what he was looking for. The folder was titled Unscheduled Events, Observation Log, 2007 to 2015. Elias's access level was 3, but years of working as a systems architect had taught him a few backdoors into the system. Inside were short, dry reports from his predecessors about strange radio signals that defied identification, about inexplicable equipment malfunctions, especially during strong auroras, about acoustic phenomena in the server rooms. One report, dated 2012, particularly caught his eye. It mentioned unstable operation of Ethernet port number 16 on experimental server Alpha Inov, which was subsequently decommissioned due to inability to resolve the anomaly. Alpha Inov, port 16. Elias frantically began searching for any information on Alpha Inov. It was, apparently, a prototype of the current VR_MAN, a test platform for some new communication or data processing technologies. But the strangest thing, there was no mention of this Alpha Inov in the official Polaris Station documentation, as if its existence had been deliberately concealed. He found old server room schematics from before the last modernization, and there, on one of them, in a corner now occupied by a solid shelving unit full of spare parts, was a small compartment labeled Special Interface Module SIN Alpha. This compartment was gone from later schematics. Elias's heart pounded. What if Port 16 wasn't just a virtual entity? What if it had a physical anchor, a remnant of that very Alpha Inov that was never fully decommissioned? Chapter 5. Ghost in the Machine. The thought of a physical source for Port 16 gave Elias no peace. If some hidden interface existed, it could explain a lot, including how the anomaly had integrated itself so deeply into Polaris Station's network. Waiting until deep night, when most personnel, including Cole, were asleep or at remote posts, Elias headed to the server room. He brought a toolkit, a powerful flashlight, and his service tablet loaded with schematics. The spot indicated on the old schematic was indeed now occupied by a massive metal shelving unit, crammed with old hard drives, power supply units, and tangled coils of cable. The unit was bolted to the floor. It took Elias some effort, but he eventually managed to slide the heavy structure aside. Behind the shelving, he found a small, recessed metal door without a handle, about 1 meter square. It bore no identifying marks, only a barely visible thin seam around its perimeter. It looked like an inspection hatch, but very old and clearly unopened for a long time. After a few minutes of searching, Elias found an almost invisible lock mechanism hidden under a layer of dust. Using a thin screwdriver and considerable effort, he managed to pick it. The door creaked open inwards, revealing a dark opening. The smell from the opening hit him, a mixture of ozone, overheated plastic, and something else, elusively alien, metallic, and organic. Elias shivered. Shining his flashlight inside, he saw a small, cramped space, no more than 1.5 meters deep. The walls were covered with soundproofing panels, now yellowed and peeling in places. In the center stood a single rack of equipment, vastly different from the modern, gleaming servers in the main hall. These were massive units with toggle switches, analog dial indicators, and rows of arcade connectors. A single green LED glowed dimly on one of the units, and there, on the front panel of the topmost unit, he saw it. A row of 15 standard Ethernet ports, and next to them, slightly set apart, a 16th. It was different from the others. The jack was a slightly different shape, more robust, and around it were traces of some dark, viscous substance, like hardened resin. A thick, shielded cable was plugged into this 16th port, disappearing somewhere into the wall, deep within the building's structure. Alpha Inov, or what was left of it. It hadn't been completely decommissioned. It had simply been sealed away. Elias cautiously stepped inside. The air was stale and cold. He examined the equipment. No manufacturer's marks, no serial numbers. This was clearly some experimental or custom-built device. He connected his tablet to one of the standard ports on the old server. After a brief struggle with outdated protocols, he managed to get a command line prompt. The system was some ancient, heavily modified version of Unix. In the logs, he found entries ending in 2012, full of error messages related to interface P16 and unstable external signal. And then he noticed something else. On the side panel of one of the units, almost invisible under the dust, symbols were scratched. The same symbols he had seen in the messages from port 16. The spiral with a dot, the trident, the eye, and several of those cosmic script symbols. His predecessors hadn't just recorded the anomaly. They had tried to understand it, and perhaps even interact with it through this interface. Suddenly, the green LED on the front panel blinked several times, then glowed a steady red. A quiet but distinct click came from a small speaker built into one of the units, followed by the breathing Elias was now familiar with. It was louder here than through his workstation, deeper, more real, as if the source of the breathing was right here, in this small room next to him. Elias felt a wave of claustrophobia wash over him. He instinctively backed towards the opening. And at that moment, a voice came from the speaker, not his own distorted, not a mechanical voice reading numbers. This was a low, guttural whisper that made his blood run cold. It spoke in a jumble of languages, fragmented phrases, but one word Elias understood perfectly, because it was spoken in clear English, almost without an accent. Found. Then there was a loud electrical crackle. The LED on the panel went out, and a silence fell in the small room, even more oppressive than the previous sounds. Elias scrambled out of the hidden compartment as if scalded. He quickly closed the hatch, somehow managed to push the shelving unit back into place, trying not to make noise. His heart was pounding in his chest. A physical source. It existed, and it knew Elias had found it. Returning to his operations center, Elias saw a new message from port 16 flashing on his monitor. It was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't a string of symbols, not an audio file, not a picture. It was a single phrase in flawless English. We said EU, Elias BNC, through Stedix, TENIS. 16 eyes, not port 16. 16 ports on that old server, and perhaps not just them. The paranoia, which until now had been mere background noise, crashed down on him with full force. Every surveillance camera, every sensor, every microphone in Polaris Station could be its eye, its ear. The isolation of the base no longer felt like protection. It had become a trap. Elias realized his investigation had gone too far. He had awakened something that had perhaps lain dormant for years, and now it knew his name. He began to think frantically about what to do next. Tell Cole. After the story of the hatch and the voice, he'd definitely be considered insane and isolated, but not in a metaphorical sense. Trying to destroy the old server. But what if that only angered the entity? What if that cable, disappearing into the wall, led to something even older and more powerful, buried beneath layers of concrete and permafrost? And then he remembered the cosmic script and the old Arc 3 satellite. If port 16 was using the base's infrastructure as an antenna, then perhaps the signal's ultimate destination, or its source, wasn't here on Earth. This thought was so grandiose and terrifying that it momentarily paralyzed him. If so, he wasn't just dealing with a local anomaly. He could be on the verge of contact with something extraterrestrial or interdimensional, something using an abandoned military facility in the Arctic as its beachhead. Chapter 6. Echo from the Abyss. Arc 3. The name haunted Elias. He spent the rest of the night and most of the next day sifting through accessible databases and scraps of information on the web, which he managed to punch through occasionally and with great difficulty via Polaris Station's official, extremely limited communication channel. Officially, Arc 3 was an experimental long-range communication satellite launched near the end of the Cold War. After several years of successful operation, it was deemed obsolete and decommissioned, supposedly burning up in the dense layers of the atmosphere. But rumors Ilias found on half-forgotten forums for radio amateurs and ufologists told a different story. Some claimed Arc 3 hadn't burned up, but had been moved to a very high, almost geostationary orbit, where it remained dormant. Others hinted that its true purpose was not so much communication as a military-tinged SETI program, searching for, and possibly even attempting to establish contact with, extraterrestrial civilizations, but using unorthodox, perhaps even dangerous technologies. One anonymous post on an encrypted forum dedicated to lost technologies mentioned that Arc 3 was equipped with a quantum resonator capable of capturing signals not only in the electromagnetic spectrum, but also in some subspace frequencies. The author claimed that during one experiment, the satellite had allegedly caught something, a powerful structured signal of unknown origin, after which communication with it became unstable, and the satellite itself began transmitting anomalous data before it was officially lost. Ilias cross-referenced the dates. Around the same time Arc 3 supposedly caught its mysterious signal, the first mentions of strange interference and anomalies related to the experimental Alpha Nobi and its 16th port began at Polaris Station, then still in its construction and early operational phase. The picture was beginning to form, and it was terrifying. What if Arc 3 had indeed caught something? Not just a signal, but a consciousness. An entity from another reality or from the depths of space. And this entity, using the satellite as a relay, had found an entry point on Earth, an experimental interface at Polaris Station, which perhaps was designed to work with such exotic types of signals. Alpha Nodi and its port 16 could have been the terrestrial receiver for what Arc 3 had picked up. And now this entity, dormant or limited in its capabilities after ALPHA Nodi was disconnected, had reawakened. Perhaps thanks to a recent update to Polaris Station's systems, which had unintentionally created new pathways for its propagation. Or maybe its activation was linked to something else, some cyclical cosmic phenomenon that had made the Arc 3 Earth channel active again. This theory explained both the correlation of Port 16's activity with the passage of certain satellites. Perhaps the entity was trying to strengthen or stabilize communication through other, more modern spacecraft, and its reaction to geomagnetic storms, which could affect subspace frequencies or the ionosphere through which the signal passed. But if this was true, what were the entity's intentions? We see you, Elias VNC, through 6 TENIS. This wasn't just a statement of fact. There was a threat in it, or an invitation. The psychological pressure on Ilias was mounting. The whispers in the walls of his room became almost constant. Sometimes he thought he heard his name, spoken by many voices at once. Shadows flickered in his peripheral vision, and reflections in dark monitor screens sometimes distorted, showing for a split second not his face, but something else. Something with incorrect geometry, with eyes located where they shouldn't be. He began to doubt his own sanity. Maybe Cole was right. Maybe this was all a product of his tired, isolated mind. He desperately clung to the facts, logs, old reports, the physical existence of the hidden server. But the line between reality and hallucination was becoming increasingly thin. One day, reviewing Port 16's logs, he discovered a new type of data. It wasn't symbols, audio, or images. It was complex mathematical formulas and diagrams describing, it seemed to him, the principles of operation of some unknown type of engine or energy source. Some formulas vaguely reminded him of equations from quantum physics and string theory, but taken to a completely new, incomprehensible level. And then came a new packet, a detailed three-dimensional model of some object. It looked like a crystal of complex, multifaceted shape, with light pulsating within it. Ilias couldn't understand its purpose, but its very geometry evoked a strange, hypnotic feeling. He felt that this shape meant something, that it was a key to something. The entity wasn't just observing, it was sharing information. Or trying to build something, using him, Ilias, as an intermediary. He decided to try a risky experiment. If the entity was trying to communicate and transmit knowledge, maybe it would respond to an attempt at cooperation. Or at least, it would give him more information about its nature. Using the same method he had used to send hear.Slip, Ilias composed a complex query. He combined some of the key symbols he believed meant question, information, and purpose, and added to them a mathematical sequence he often saw in port 16's transmissions, Fibonacci numbers. He didn't know if it would work, but it was better than just waiting. The answer came a few minutes later, and it was unlike anything he had seen before. His workstation monitor went blank, and then, slowly, pixel by pixel, an image began to form. It was a star chart, but the stars on it were not arranged as on any chart he knew. Some constellations were distorted, others were missing, and in their place were new, unfamiliar ones. In the center of the chart, a single bright point pulsed, from which thin lines radiated, connecting it to several other, less bright points. One of these lines pointed to a small, barely visible pictogram depicting a planet with rings, very similar to Saturn. But next to it was another pictogram, a spiral with a dot, his symbol. And beneath the chart, an inscription slowly appeared, composed of those same cosmic script symbols he had seen on the old server and in the logs. Sodiem duels and Yening roughly. WRC, Paith, connection. And then below, in English, we are Yigechi Way, the STR bridge. Complete the ARRA, the star bridge. Complete the array/device. Ilias felt cold sweat trickle down his back. The entity didn't just want contact. It wanted him to do something, to build or activate something. The array, that could be the very device whose model it had sent him. A device that, perhaps, was meant to amplify or stabilize this star bridge. And then he understood something else. 16 ports on Alpha A-No-D, 16 eyes. This might not just be the number of channels. It could be related to the geometry of that crystal it had shown him, the number of its faces or vertices. But what would happen if this star bridge was fully activated? Would just a communication channel open? Or could something, or someone, pass through this bridge? At that moment, Lieutenant Cole walked into the operations center. He looked grimmer than usual. Vance, his voice lacked its usual sarcastic tone. Pack your things. They've sent transport for you. You're flying to the mainland. Immediately, Elias looked at him, bewildered. What? Why? What happened? They didn't tell me the reasons, Cole cut him off. Orders from the top. Psychological evaluation. And I understand, long-term leave. It seems your network anomalies finally attracted the attention of those who shouldn't have been bothered. Cole's gaze lingered on Ilias's monitor, where the star chart with its mysterious symbols still glowed. The lieutenant frowned but said nothing. Ilias was being taken away. He was being removed from Polaris Station, but he knew this wasn't the end. The entity had chosen him. It had shown him the way, and the words "complete the ARRA" echoed in his head like a command impossible to refuse. He didn't know whether to be glad for this rescue or terrified, because he was taking away not just memories of a nightmare, he was taking away knowledge, dangerous knowledge, and the feeling that the star bridge awaited its builder. And wherever he ended up, Port 16, or whatever stood behind it, would find a way to contact him again. He was sure of it. After all, they saw him, through 16 eyes, and perhaps now through his own. To be continued. The Zero Room. Chapter 1. Dust of roads and a taste of oblivion dust, thick and reddish-brown, billowed from under the wheels of the rented Opal, immediately settling on everything: the dashboard, my jeans, the carefully packed equipment containers in the trunk. I, Dr. Adam Harris, a postdoctoral historian specializing in the vanished towns of Eastern Europe and their sinister connection to totalitarian ideologies, felt more like an archaeologist excavating a forgotten civilization than a desk-bound scholar, though in essence, that's what it was. My current subject was the former Soviet pioneer camp Solnikny, lost in the forests of eastern Germany, not far from the Polish border. Officially, it had been abandoned since 1983, following some incident, the details of which were vaguely mentioned in archival reports as violation of sanitary norms and necessity for major renovation. But rumors circulating in narrow circles of anomalous zone researchers and dark tourism enthusiasts spoke of something else. Of strange lights, inexplicable sounds, and most intriguing to me, the possible use of the camp for certain clandestine educational programs that went far beyond standard pioneer indoctrination. My hypothesis, still timid and unformed, linked such closed facilities with experiments in forging the new man, so characteristic of totalitarian thinking. The car, bouncing over another pothole, made me grip the steering wheel tighter. The road, if you could call it that, had degenerated into a barely visible track overgrown with weeds. The forest around grew denser, darker. The sun, which had recently peeked through the crowns, now only occasionally sent slanting, dusty rays. I checked the printout of an old Soviet military map, a gift from an eccentric collector in Berlin. According to it, I was almost there. And then, around another bend, through a dense wall of trees, an outline emerged. Rusty, lopsided gates with a faded star and a barely discernible inscription in 2 languages. Pioneer Camp Solnikny, and below, in German, Pionierlager Sonnenstrahl. Beyond them, an asphalt path, cracked and overgrown with moss, led into the depths of the territory. I killed the engine. Silence, thick and almost palpable, descended upon me. Only the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of some bird. The feeling was twofold. On one hand, a typical abandoned site, of which I'd seen many. On the other, something subtly unsettling hung in the very air, a stale exhalation of fear. Getting out of the car, I looked around. Several 2-story buildings of peeling brick, a wooden dining hall with broken windows, a grassy sports field with a lone rusted pull-up bar, all standard. But something was off. Flattened grass near the gate, fresh tire tracks, not mine. Someone had been here recently. Stalkers? Local teenagers? I took my backpack from the trunk with the essentials: flashlight, camera, voice recorder, notebook, multi-tool. The containers with more serious equipment for sample analysis and measurements I left in the car for now. First, reconnaissance. The nearest building, judging by the remnants of a sign, was administrative. The door yielded with a long creak. Inside, semi-darkness reigned, along with the smell of dampness, mold, and something else, sweetly decaying like old books forgotten in an attic. Scattered furniture, scraps of paper on the floor, overturned cabinets. Someone had already thoroughly rummaged through here. I methodically went from room to room, taking pictures and making notes. In one of the offices, cluttered with folders of yellow documents, my attention was drawn to a map spread out on a table. It was a plan of the camp, hand-drawn on graph paper, more detailed than the one I had. And on it, in the northwestern part, where official diagrams showed a vacant lot or utility buildings, a rectangle was circled in red pencil with the inscription, Room 0. Room 0, I muttered. None of the official diagrams I had studied in the archives showed such an object. I turned the map over. On the back, in the same red pencil, in a neat, almost calligraphic script, was a date, 10.17/2023. Expected. I went cold. Today's date. The historian's brain instantly switched to analysis mode. A prank. Definitely. One of the local researchers found out about my arrival, perhaps from online forums where I had carelessly mentioned my plans, and decided to play a joke. Or it was some kind of game, a quest organized for extreme tourists. Room 0. Sounds like the title of a cheap horror movie. I smirked, but the smirk was nervous. I examined the map more closely. The paper was old, but not old enough to match the age of the camp. The pencil markings were fresh. Yes, definitely a prank. I put the map in a special artifact bag. It would make an amusing souvenir. Despite my skepticism, a faint sense of unease had settled deep inside. Expected. Who or what was expected? Me? The sun began to set, painting the sky in crimson tones. I decided to set up a temporary camp in the administrative building. It seemed the most intact. I laid out my sleeping bag on an old sofa, prepared a gas burner for dinner. Night fell on Solnikny quickly, as if someone had covered it with a black shroud. The silence became even denser, oppressive. I tried to read by the light of my headlamp, but my thoughts kept returning to the stupid map and this Room 0. Around 12:30, I was already starting to doze off when it happened. First, a barely perceptible flicker in the hallway. I froze. Then again, light. In one of the ceiling fixtures, ancient and covered in cobwebs, a light bulb flickered on and off for a moment. Then again, and again, as if someone was playing with the switch. I jumped up, my heart pounding. Old wiring, I tried to convince myself. Short circuit from the dampness, but the flickering was somehow rhythmic, deliberate. I turned on the voice recorder just out of habit, as I'd always did on such expeditions. Recording check, I said, my voice trembling. Approximately 12:37 a.m. Unexplained light flickering in the hallway of the administrative building. I went out into the hallway, illuminating the path with my flashlight. The bulb was no longer flickering. Silence. Only my own heavy sigh. Nerves, I decided. Isolation, fatigue, the stupid map. Returning to the room, I decided to listen to the recording, just to make sure my voice hadn't trembled too much. My words sounded clear. And then, after my phrase, a quiet, barely audible whisper emerged on the recording. Several voices, intertwining like dry leaves in the wind. Indecipherable, but they were definitely voices. Children's, or just high-pitched, distorted. I sat, petrified, staring at the small black voice recorder as if it were a venomous snake. There was no one else in the room. The windows were closed. The door too. This wasn't a prank. This no longer felt like a prank. Chapter 2, Inks of the Past and Shadows of the Present. I met the dawn broken and sleep-deprived. The night passed in an anxious semi-consciousness where every rustle made me jump and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to take on sinister shapes. The whisper on the voice recorder. I replayed the recording over and over, trying to make out the words, but it was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Sometimes I thought I heard individual syllables, fragments of phrases in a mixture of German and Russian, but I couldn't be sure. The sunlight, filtering through the dirty windows, somewhat dispelled the night's fears, but left an aftertaste of issy anxiety. The rational part of my brain still clung to the idea of a prank, complex, multi-layered, but a prank nonetheless. Perhaps there were hidden speakers somewhere in the camp. Or were those who left the map still here watching me? I decided to distract myself with work. Since I was here, I needed to use my time wisely. I retrieved containers of documents from the car that I had managed to obtain from various German archives, copies of counselors' journals, lists of children by troop, a few photographs, reports on the camp's coziest Vernaya Dietolnost, economic activities. My primary task was to compare this official data with what I would find here on site. I spread the papers on a relatively clean table in the same office where I found the map. I started with the attendance logs. Names, surnames, dates of birth. Standard bureaucracy. I meticulously entered the data into my laptop, creating a database. After several hours of painstaking work, I stumbled upon something that made me freeze. In the list of children for the 2nd Troop, summer of 1978, there was a name, Maximilian Harris. Harris, my surname, Maximilian, my paternal grandfather's name. My heart skipped a beat. My grandfather, a full-blooded American born in Boston, could not, under any circumstances, have been in a Soviet pioneer camp in East Germany in 1978. At that time, he was teaching history at the University of Chicago. Coincidence, I muttered, though my voice sounded unsure. A simple coincidence. The surname Harris isn't the rarest, though not typical for Germany. The name Maximilian, likewise, but for two such coincidences in one place. I rubbed my eyes. Fatigue. Definitely, this was a figment of my imagination, amplified by stress and lack of sleep. I set that list aside, deciding to return to it later with a clear head. I switched to the photographs. Several group shots of pioneers in red neckerchiefs, lined up for assembly. Serious, focused faces. The quality of the photos was poor, but they conveyed the atmosphere of the era. I began scanning them so I could later enlarge and examine the details. And again, that strange feeling. In one of the photos, in the back row, stood a boy who seemed vaguely familiar, something in his posture, in the way he tilted his head. I enlarged the image on my laptop screen. The face was blurry, but no, it couldn't be. It was just a play of light and shadow. I decided to focus on Room 0. If it wasn't a prank, then what? Comparing the hand-drawn map with the official plans, I realized that Room 0 should be somewhere near the old utility buildings, perhaps even underground. but on the official diagrams, only a storage shed and a boiler room were indicated there. No rooms numbered 0. Armed with a flashlight and the map, I set off in search. The utility block consisted of several dilapidated sheds and a squat boiler room building with a tall brick chimney. I methodically examined every corner, every structure. Dust, trash, rusty junk. Nothing to indicate a hidden room. The walls were intact, with no signs of recent alterations. There were no basements, apparently. I returned to the administrative building, disappointed and even more puzzled. If Room 0 existed, it was well hidden. Or the map was indeed just someone's invention. In the evening, I sat down with the documents again. I decided to recheck the list with the name Maximilian Harris. I opened the folder and froze. The name was there, but something had changed. Next to the name, in the year of birth column, was a different date. My grandfather's date of birth, and in the place of residence before arrival at Camp column, there was a city name, very similar in spelling to Boston, but with a couple of transposed letters, as if someone had written it by ear, not knowing the exact name. I felt a chill run down my spine. This could no longer be a coincidence. This was impossible. The documents, were they changing? Or was I going mad? I frantically began to go through other papers. The report of the 1st Troops counselor. Yesterday, I had briefly skimmed it. Ordinary notes about children's behavior, about organized events. Now, on one of the pages, I saw a neatly written name, Adam. Just Adam, no surname. In the context of the report, it looked out of place, like a typo. But I knew that yesterday that name hadn't been there. My gaze fell on the stack of scanned photographs. I opened that same group shot where I thought I'd seen a familiar boy. I zoomed in. The image on the laptop screen was clearer than I remembered. The boy in the back row. He had my eyes. My hair only lighter, like in my childhood. And the caption under the photograph, typed on an old typewriter, read, Troop Young Leninists, July 1979. Counselor, Comrade Smirnov. 3rd row, 4th from left. Harris A. Harris A. Adam Harris. I recoiled from the table, nearly knocking over my chair. My breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be. This was some kind of nightmarish, absurd dream. The documents, the photographs, they weren't just changing. They were pulling me into their distorted reality, rewriting the past, weaving my own identity into it. Camp Solnikny was not just an abandoned place. It was something else. Something alive and sinister. And it seemed to be waiting for me. Chapter 3. Voices in the static and shadows in the periphery. The following days turned into an agonizing series of attempts to maintain sanity in the face of escalating absurdity. I slept in snatches, constantly listening to the rustles and creaks of the old building. The voice recorder became my constant companion, capturing not only my mumblings, but also what shouldn't exist. The voices, they became clearer. No longer just an indecipherable whisper, but fragments of phrases, children's laughter, crying, sometimes stern shouts in German or Russian. It seemed the camp walls were saturated with them like a sponge. Sometimes, listening to the recordings, I could pick out individual words. Quiet hour, assembly, naughty, room 0. This last one was repeated particularly often, uttered sometimes in a frightened whisper, sometimes with a sinister intonation. The technology I had come to rely on began to fail me or worse, become part of the anomaly. My laptop periodically froze, strange symbols appearing on the screen, resembling runes or distorted Cyrillic letters. The satellite phone, my only connection to the outside world, showed no signal most of the time, and when a connection momentarily appeared, all I heard in the receiver was crackling and the same ghostly voices as on the recorder. Visual anomalies also intensified. Before, it was just shadows in my peripheral vision, fleeting movements I could dismiss as fatigue. Now I began to see silhouettes. Blurry, translucent figures of children in pioneer uniforms, flitting in doorways, outside windows, sometimes even in the same room where I was. They never approached, never tried to interact, just appeared for a moment and vanished, leaving behind a wave of icy cold. One day, walking down the hallway of the 2nd floor of a residential building, I saw at its end, by the window, a girl of about 10 with 2 light pigtails. She stood with her back to me, looking at the overgrown yard. I froze, afraid to scare away the vision. Then slowly, very slowly, she began to turn. I didn't see her face, it was hidden in shadow, but I felt a gaze fixated on me, full of unchildlike sorrow and something else, expectation. Before I could say or do anything, the figure dissolved like smoke. The documents continued their monstrous transformation. Now, it wasn't just my surname and name appearing in lists and reports. I started finding the names of my university colleagues, friends, even distant relatives, written into the context of pioneer camp life. My academic supervisor, Professor Eleanor Vance, a stern and meticulous woman in her 60s, was listed in one of the updated camp orders as senior pioneer leader responsible for ideological work. The photographs also changed. The children's faces became increasingly recognizable, as if the camp was creating a gruesome collage of my past and present, populating its ghostly troops with phantoms of those I knew. The boy in the photograph, Harris A., now looked at me with frightening clarity. It was me. No doubt. Only his eyes. They held the same sorrow as the girl in the hallway, and also some hidden terror. I began to fear my own memories. They became unreliable, confused. Sometimes it seemed I actually remembered something from life in this camp. The smell of burnt porridge in the dining hall, the creak of swings on the playground, the cold gloom of room 0. I pushed these false memories away, clinging to reality, but it was slipping away like sand through my fingers. One day, sifting through old medical records in the infirmary, I came across an entry about patient Harris A. diagnosis: increased anxiety, nightmares, disorientation. Observation and supportive therapy in isolation recommended. Referred to special group. Supervisor, Dr. Steiner. The signature was illegible. Dr. Steiner. I had seen that name somewhere before. It seemed, in one of the reports on non-standard pedagogical methods I had studied before the trip. But there, he was mentioned in passing as a consultant. Special group, Room 0. The connection was becoming increasingly obvious and sinister. I no longer doubted that something terrible had happened in this camp, something beyond simple ideological education, some kind of experiments. And I, willingly or unwillingly, was becoming a part of them, or perhaps their new victim. Fear gave way to a kind of desperate resolve. I had to understand what happened here, not for science, for my own survival, and for that boy in the photograph, who was me and not me at the same time. Chapter 4. Code in the flicker and echoes in the wires. Despite the growing horror and doubts about my own sanity, my analytical mind wouldn't give up. If this place followed some rules, some perverted logic, I had to find it. I began to systematize all the anomalies, noting down the time, place, type of manifestation, and my sensations in a notebook. The result was a gruesome, yet structured, picture. The flickering light in the administrative building, which I had initially dismissed as old wiring, turned out not to be random. It repeated with a certain periodicity, especially at night. Short flashes, long ones, pauses, Morse code. I pulled out a code reference book from my backpack, a habit from my youthful ham radio hobby. I spent several nights shivering from cold and fear, writing down sequences of flashes and trying to decipher them. Mostly, it was gibberish, a random set of letters. But sometimes, words slipped through. Help don't BLIEVE. They are LISTNA 0. And again, Room 0. Who was transmitting these messages? The ghosts of the camp? Or was it another game of my inflamed imagination, finding patterns where there were none? I decided to investigate the soundscape more thoroughly. My professional voice recorder had a wide frequency range recording function. I left it on for several hours in different rooms, and then analyzed the recordings on my laptop using special spectral analysis software. The results were astonishing. Besides the already familiar voices and whispers, the recordings contained powerful infrasound components, frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, which are known to cause anxiety, nausea, panic, and even visual hallucinations. Was this infrasound of natural origin, for example, due to wind whistling through the building structures, or geological activity, or was it generated artificially? But that wasn't all. On some recordings, especially those made near the administrative building and the presumed location of Room 0, I discovered strange, high-frequency signals like interference or the carrier frequency of an unknown transmitter. They were weak, but regular, like the beating of some invisible heart. I remembered the old mainframe computers mentioned in some archival documents as part of the camp's educational equipment. Could they still be functioning on some residual level, generating these fields and signals? Or was it something else, more ancient and alien? In one of the abandoned classrooms, I found remnants of such equipment, bulky racks with reel-to-reel tape recorders, punch tapes, some panels with toggle switches and indicators. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, wires gnawed by rats. But when I touched the metal casing of one of the units, I thought I felt a faint vibration, and for a moment, that same high-frequency squeal resonated in my ears. The camp wasn't just inhabited by ghosts of the past. It was active. It radiated. It influenced. The photographs continued their transformation. Now it wasn't just the appearance of familiar faces. In some pictures, the background behind the pioneers distorted, strange geometric patterns appeared, resembling fractals or diagrams of some unimaginable constructions. In one photo, where I stood with a group of children at the entrance to the dining hall, behind us in the doorway, a dark, elongated, faceless figure flickered for a fraction of a second, unlike any human or animal. When I blinked, it was gone, but the chill of its presence remained. I began to suspect that the changes in documents and photographs weren't just distortions of the past. It was an attempt at assimilation, a rewriting of my personality, my history. The camp was trying to make me its own, to integrate me into its nightmarish matrix. And Room Zero was obviously the key to this process. It was there, I now supposed, that the source of the anomalies, or at least their focus, was located. It might not be just a room, but some device, a mechanism left by the creators of this place, or something they had awakened and couldn't control. My search for Room Zero resumed with new vigor. I walked the territory again and again, checking the cursed map, tapping walls, peering into every dark corner. I looked for inconsistencies in the architecture, signs of hidden passages, any hints that the official plans were lying. On the walls of some buildings, especially in remote and abandoned parts of the camp, I began to notice strange symbols. They were scratched with something sharp, sometimes painted. Some resembled elements of Slavic or Germanic runes, others were completely unfamiliar, complex, asymmetrical signs that evoked an inexplicable anxiety. I photographed them, trying to find some system, some connection. One day, exploring the basement of one of the residential buildings, damp, cluttered with rotten rags and broken furniture, I noticed such a symbol on the far wall, larger and clearer than the others. It was scratched directly onto the brickwork. I approached, illuminating it with my flashlight. And then I saw that part of the wall under the symbol looked different. The bricks were newer, the mortar fresher, as if there had once been a passage here, later bricked up. My heart beat faster. Could this be it? The way to Room Zero? Chapter 5. The sealed door and whispers from underground. The wall in the basement looked suspicious. I returned to the administrative building for my multi-tool and a small entrenching tool I'd always carried for unforeseen digging. The thought that I might be on the verge of unraveling the mystery of Room Zero gave me strength and, at the same time, evoked a dull, underlying fear. What would I find behind this wall? And did I want to know? Pushing aside my doubts, I set to work. The mortar between the bricks yielded surprisingly easily, as if the masonry had been done hastily. After an hour of painstaking effort, I managed to remove the first brick. Behind it was emptiness. I widened the breach, working with feverish haste. The smell that hit my nostrils was heavy, stale, a mixture of dust, ozone, and something else, metallic and elusively alien. When the opening was large enough to squeeze through, I shone my flashlight inside. Before me was a narrow, unlit corridor, sloping downwards. The walls were concrete, rough, without any finishing. This was definitely not part of the original camp design. It was something later, hidden. With a pounding heart, I squeezed into the passage. The corridor was not long, about 10 meters, and ended in a massive steel door with a hermetic seal, like the hatch of a submarine or a bomb shelter. There were no markings on the door, except for a single digit scratched with something sharp, 0. Room 0. I had found it. The handle of the seal turned with difficulty, with a protracted screech of rusty metal. The door slowly, with a hiss as if releasing stale air, opened inwards. The room beyond the door was small, round, windowless. The walls were lined with some dark, matte panels that absorbed the light of my flashlight. In the center of the room stood a massive chair, similar to a dentist's or pilot's seat, entangled in a multitude of wires and tubes that disappeared into the walls and floor. Around the chair were racks of incomprehensible equipment, reel-to-reel tape recorders, oscilloscopes, panels with rows of toggle switches and blinking, yes, some of them glowed dimly, indicators. It was a mixture of Soviet-era computers from the 1970s, familiar to me from descriptions, and something entirely different alien. Some units had a strange non-Euclidean geometry, and the materials they were made of resembled neither metal nor plastic. The air here was even heavier, saturated with static electricity. A quiet, almost imperceptible hum filled my ears, the same one I had recorded. On one of the panels, I noticed several notebooks with worn cardboard covers. With trembling hands, I picked one up. It was a lab journal, filled with cramped handwriting in a mixture of Russian and German. The dates began in 1975. Project Kronos read the first entry. Phase 1. Study of the influence of resonant frequencies on temporal perception. Subject No. 1. Child, 8 years old male. Preliminary results. Disorientation. Short-term memory lapses. I flipped through the pages, and the hair on my head stood on end from horror. These were protocols of inhuman experiments. Children, obviously the most problematic ones or orphans from the camp, were subjected to some fields, sound frequencies, possibly psychotropic substances. The goal, judging by the fragmented entries, was expanding the boundaries of perception, accessing the collective unconscious, correcting deviant behavior through modification of the personality's timeline. Dr. Steiner. His name appeared frequently in the records. He was the project leader. In one of the notebooks, I found later entries dated to the early 1980s. Their tone became increasingly alarmed. Uncontrolled manifestations. Subjects report alien memories, see people from the future. Spatiotemporal distortions in Zone 0, Room 0, are intensifying. Equipment is unstable, anomalous energy spikes of unknown nature are being recorded. Contact was made, but it's not what we expected. It is not sentient, or its consciousness is beyond comprehension. It seeps through like water through sand. It distorts everything. Reality, memory, the very fabric of existence. The experiment must be terminated immediately. Isolate Zone 0. Erase all records. Close the camp. We opened Pandora's box, or something far worse. The last entry, made with a trembling hand, was dated October 1983, the time of the camp's official closure. It is here. It is not confined to Room 0. It is spreading. It is changing the past. It is writing itself into history. We have all become part of it. There is no salvation. Only oblivion or an eternal cycle. I put the notebook down. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the flashlight. So the rumors were true. Camp Solnikny was not just a recreation site, but a monstrous laboratory. And what they had awakened or created here had not disappeared. It was still here. It was the cause of everything that was happening. It was changing documents. It was creating phantoms. It was trying to assimilate me, just like those unfortunate children. Suddenly, the equipment in the room came to life. The indicators on the panels blinked brighter, the reels on the tape recorders slowly turned, and a low, vibrating hum emanated from the speakers, making my ears pop. The air thickened, became almost tangible. I felt an invisible force pressing down on me. And then I heard a voice, not in the voice recorder, not in my head. A real, physical voice, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was cold, emotionless, synthetic, yet within it echoed the chilling cacophony of children's voices, blended into a gruesome symphony. Welcome, Subject Alpha 7, the voice intoned. Integration procedure resumed. You are late. You were expected. I stumbled back towards the door. Who are you? What do you want? I shouted, though I knew the question was pointless. We are memory. We are time. We require completeness. Your history will become part of ours. Your past, present, and future will merge with the cycle. The light from my flashlight flickered and died. The room was filled with a dim, pulsating reddish glow emanating from the indicators on the panels. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on bizarre, terrifying forms. I realized I had found Room Zero, and now it had found me. Chapter 6. Tears in the fabric of reality and echoes of my own fears. Panic, cold and clammy, seized me. I lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The locking handle didn't move, as if it had been welded shut. I was trapped. Trapped with this thing. Let me go. What are you? My voice cracked. We are the echo of the incomplete. We are potential become reality. You are here because you are part of the pattern. Your research, your history, your genetic memory, all of it led you here, Adam Harris. You are both key and lock. The voice spoke perfect English, but with that same eerie, synthetic timbre that held echoes of countless other voices merged into one. I cowered in a corner, trying to catch my breath, to gather my thoughts. If this it knew my name, it had already penetrated deep into my life, into my very being. The altered documents, the photographs, those were just the first steps. The equipment in the room hummed louder. The air vibrated. I felt waves of nausea wash over me, my head spun. Images began to appear on the dark paneled walls, blurry like an old film reel. I saw familiar places, my office at the university, my childhood home, the streets of Boston. But they were all distorted, veiled in a sinister haze. And in these scenes, figures of pioneers appeared, shadows from Camp Solnikny, weaving themselves into the fabric of my memories. What are you doing to me? We are restoring integrity. Your ancestor, Maximilian Harris, was one of the first contactees. Unwittingly, his mind brushed against us when he studied anomalous zones linked to ancient cults. That connection was passed to you. You are the missing fragment. My grandfather? He never spoke of such research. A historian, yes, but cults. Anomalous zones? It sounded like madness. Or had he hidden it? Room Zero, the voice continued, is not just a room. It is an interface. A point of singularity where time and space are unstable. Here we can adjust reality. Augment it. Dr. Steiner and his team tried to use us to control us. They failed. They only opened the door wider. On one of the walls, Steiner's face appeared, contorted with terror, his eyes wild. Then it shifted to the face of the boy, Harris A., looking at me with an expression of unspeakable pleading. You can't change the past, I yelled. Past, present, future. These are merely constructs of your perception. For us, time is an ocean where everything exists simultaneously. We can navigate its currents, create new streams, connect disparate droplets. I remembered my own theories about totalitarian regimes, their obsession with rewriting history, creating the new man. What was happening here was a monstrous embodiment of those ideas, taken to an absolute by an inhuman intellect. But why? What's your purpose? Purpose? Does a hurricane need a purpose? Does a black hole need a purpose? We are a process, a drive towards absorption, assimilation towards completion. Each new story, each new personality makes us fuller, more stable. I understood. This wasn't evil in the human sense. It was some fundamental force, a blind, all-consuming hunger, feeding on consciousness, memories, the very fabric of reality. And Camp Solnikny, Room Zero, this was its gullet. Suddenly, a thought struck me, desperate, insane, but the only one that seemed like a lifeline. If this it fed on information, on structure, then perhaps it could be overloaded, confused. I closed my eyes, trying to concentrate, to shut out the oppressive hum and nightmarish visions. I began to remember. Not my personal experiences, they were already too vulnerable to infected. I started to recall historical facts, dates, names, concepts, complex philosophical systems, mathematical formulas I once learned, poems in forgotten languages I'd read out of curiosity. I dumped into my consciousness, and therefore into Room Zero, the entire informational baggage I had accumulated over years of study and research. A disjointed, chaotic flood of data. The hum in the room changed. It became intermittent, arrhythmic. The voice fell silent. I continued, mentally shouting theorems, quoting ancient texts, listing dynasties of Chinese emperors and the classifications of Sumerian gods. I was trying to create informational noise, a white noise of consciousness that might drown out or confuse this entity. At some point, I felt the pressure ease. The pulsating red light grew dimmer. The visions on the walls began to break apart, turning into static like on a broken television. Error, error, data corrupted, system unstable, rasped the voice, now distorted, devoid of its former confidence. I opened my eyes. The door. The locking handle yielded slightly. I threw my whole body against it. More effort. With a gut-wrenching screech, the bolt slid back. I yanked the door open and tumbled out into the narrow corridor leading from room 0. Behind me, there was a pop, like a light bulb bursting, and the hum ceased. Without looking back, I scrambled down the corridor, squeezed through the breach in the basement wall, and, stumbling, ran towards the exit of the building into the fresh air. Chapter 7. Fleeing through a disintegrating world. I ran, heedless of the path, through the undergrowth, stumbling over tree roots, scratching my face and hands on branches. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, my lungs burned. Behind me lay Camp Solniki, that accursed place that had nearly consumed me whole. Reaching the car, I turned the key in the ignition with trembling hands. The engine, to my immense relief, started on the first try. I sharply turned the Opel around and sped away at maximum speed along the broken forest road, leaving clouds of reddish-brown dust behind me. Only after driving several kilometers did I allow myself to slow down a bit and catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, sweat and tears streamed down my face, from tension, from horror, from relief. I had survived. I had escaped. But something was wrong. Looking around, I noticed strange, barely perceptible changes in the surrounding world. Colors seemed slightly distorted, too bright, or conversely faded. Shadows fell at unnatural angles. For a moment, I thought I saw the figure of a pioneer flicker at the roadside, but when I turned sharply, no one was there. It's just residual effects, I tried to convince myself. Stress, hallucinations from the ordeal. But doubts gnawed at me. Had I truly damaged that entity in room 0 with my informational assault? Or had I only temporarily disrupted its operation, and it was already recovering, extending its invisible tendrils after me? I glanced at my hands on the steering wheel. On my wrist, where my watch usually was, the skin was smooth. The watch was gone. I clearly remembered putting it on that morning. I searched my pockets. Empty. It was a small thing, but unsettling. When I reached the nearest town, it was already getting dark. I stopped at a small hotel, got a room. First thing, a hot shower, an attempt to wash away the sticky horror of the camp. Then, food, any food. Sitting in the empty hotel cafe, picking at a tasteless schnitzel, I tried to analyze what had happened. Project Chronos, experiments on children, an entity distorting reality. It sounded like the script of a madman's film. But I had been there. I had seen it. I had felt it. I took out my laptop. I urgently needed to back up all the files, photos, recordings I had made at the camp, if of course they hadn't changed already. To my surprise, most of the files were there. Photos, audio recordings of voices, scans of the normal documents I had brought with me. But those that had started changing in the camp, with my surname, with the names of my acquaintances, they were gone, as if they had never existed. The map with room 0 had also disappeared from the artifact bag. The lab journals I found in room 0, I hadn't taken them with me. In my panic, I had just left them there. Now, they were most likely lost forever, or changed beyond recognition. I had no proof. Nothing but my own memories, which were already beginning to seem dubious, clouded by a haze of nightmare. That night, I dreamed of the camp. Children with empty eyes, marching on the parade ground. Dr. Steiner, smiling his eerie, knowing smile. And room 0, pulsating with red light, pulling me into its bottomless vortex. I woke up with a heavy head. I needed to get as far away from here as possible. Go back home to America. Forget all this like a bad dream. On the way to the airport, I noticed a few more oddities. Road signs with distorted inscriptions. Faces on advertising billboards that for a moment seemed familiar, as if they were the same children from the camp, only older. A song on the radio, whose lyrics suddenly formed a warning. It's following you. You can't escape. Paranoia? Or was reality truly continuing to disintegrate around me like a worn-out fabric? At Berlin Airport, everything looked normal. Bustle, announcements in several languages, rushing passengers. I checked in, went through passport control. Everything went smoothly. Too smoothly. Sitting in the departure lounge by the gate, I tried to read a book, but the letters blurred before my eyes. I felt someone's gaze on me. I looked around, nothing suspicious. And then my gaze fell on the electronic departures board. My flight, NLH 412, Berlin, New York. All correct. But next to it in the status column, instead of boarding, the words integration completing flashed for a moment. I blinked. The status changed to boarding. I jumped up, my heart pounding furiously. This couldn't be true. It was just a trick of the imagination. But when I looked at my hands, I saw it. The watch, my watch, on my wrist, the same one that had disappeared in the camp. And on its face, instead of the time, 2 digits were frozen, 0 o'clock. Chapter 8. The New Normalcy and Whispers in the Walls. The flight across the Atlantic passed in a fog. I barely slept, jolting at every rustle, scrutinizing the faces of flight attendants and other passengers, trying to detect signs that they too were part of this nightmare. But everyone behaved normally. The plane landed safely in New York. I returned to my apartment in Brooklyn, to familiar surroundings. Books on shelves, stacks of papers on my desk, the view from the window of a busy street. Everything was in its place, almost. Small details. A photograph of my parents on the bookshelf, now they were dressed in strange, unfamiliar clothes, and in the background, behind them, a corner of some barrack was visible, very similar to those at Solnikny. A painting on the wall, an abstract piece I bought at a flea market. Its patterns now clearly showed those same symbols I had seen on the camp walls. My academic papers, articles, dissertation drafts. New paragraphs had appeared in them, references to non-existent authors, entire chapters dedicated to the phenomenon of temporal instability in closed collectives, and the theory of resonant influence on historical memory. The text was written in my style, but I didn't remember ever writing it. Camp Solnikny hadn't let me go. It had followed me, weaving itself into my reality, modifying it subtly, insidiously. I lived in a world that was almost the same as before, but with barely perceptible, sinister changes visible only to me. I tried to tell a few close colleagues what had happened. They listened with sympathy, nodded, and then tactfully advised me to rest, to see a specialist. In their eyes, I saw concern, but not belief. To them, I was a man who had experienced severe stress, perhaps a nervous breakdown. No one took my story seriously. Sometimes, walking down the street, I saw them, children in pioneer uniforms. They would just stand on a corner, looking at me with their empty eyes, and then dissolve into the crowd. No one but me noticed them. At night, I often heard whispers, quiet, indecipherable, seeming to come from the very walls of my apartment. Sometimes they were children's voices, sometimes that same synthetic voice from Room Zero, repeating fragments of phrases, integration, cycle, completeness. I stopped trying to fight. What was the point? How can you fight something that changes the very fabric of reality, your memories, your past? I learned to live with it, with this new normalcy. I continued my work as a historian, but now my research had acquired a new sinister focus. I searched for other anomalous zones, other vanished towns, other traces of similar experiments. I knew they existed. Room Zero at Camp Solnikny was not unique. It was just one node in a global network, one breach through which it seeped into our world. Sometimes I thought I was going mad, but then I would find another document, another strange record, another hint that I was not alone in my knowledge, that there had been others before me who had encountered this, and they too had either disappeared or been declared insane. The price of knowledge was high. I was forever changed. My perception of the world was distorted. I bore the burden of dangerous knowledge that no one wanted to hear. I was doomed to an eternal struggle, or rather to an eternal coexistence with this horror, hidden beneath the thin veneer of everyday life. One evening, sorting through old mail, I came across an inconspicuous envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it was a hand-drawn map of some abandoned facility. It looked like an old radio astronomy observatory somewhere in the New Mexico desert. And in one of the buildings, a rectangle was circled in red pencil with the inscription, Observation Point Alpha. On the back of the sheet, in the same neat, almost calligraphic script as on the map from Solnikny, was a date 03.23, next year. Expected. I stared at the map for a long time. The horror, which I thought had dulled, reared its head again, but with it came a strange, perverse sense of anticipation or resignation to the inevitable. I knew I would have to go, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't do otherwise anymore. I was part of this cycle. Key and lock. The threat had not disappeared. It had merely lurked, changed form, retreated, only to strike anew. And I, Dr. Adam Harris, historian of cursed places, was its unwitting conductor and eternal prisoner. I carefully folded the map and put it in my desk drawer, next to the watch frozen at 0 o'clock. The world around me lived its ordinary life, unaware of what lurked beneath its facade. And I just waited for the next visit, waited for the whispers in the walls to call my name again. Window from the deep. Chapter 1. Return to the abyss. The crushing silence was the first thing that greeted Dr. Aris Thorne in the Triton 7 transport capsule as it slowly descended through the water column. A silence broken only by the steady hum of life support systems and the occasional, almost imperceptible creak of the hull resisting colossal pressure. 6,000 meters. That figure echoed in Aris's mind with a dull, unsettling thrum. 6 kilometers of water overhead. 6 kilometers of isolation. He rubbed his tired eyes. The flight to the Poseidon floating base and the subsequent hectic preparations for the dive had exhausted him. Aris was a marine engineer and hydronaut, one of the best at geotech moraine, a specialist in deep-sea systems and robotics. His current task was non-trivial, to lead a mission to restore and partially modernize Oceanos 1, a research platform that had sunk almost half a century ago in this god-forsaken spot in the Pacific Ocean. In 1972, communication with Oceanos 1 had ceased abruptly and permanently. The official version, a catastrophic failure of life support systems due to unforeseen seismic activity. But rumors, as they often do, painted far grimmer pictures. Aris tried to push them away. He was a man of science, of logic, facts, blueprints, calculations. That was his element. Oceanos 1 rested on a relatively flat section of the abyssal plain, surrounded by fields of manganese nodules. Decades later, the corporation decided that the unique data potentially preserved in its black boxes, and the very opportunity to study the effects of such prolonged exposure of complex machinery at such depths, were worth the cost of a risky expedition. The capsule docked smoothly with the airlock of Hydra VI, a temporary underwater module that was to be their home and operational center for the coming weeks. Hydra VI was an engineering marvel, compact yet packed with the most modern equipment, capable of supporting 3 people autonomously for a month. Besides Aris, the team included Kenji Tanaka, a young but talented programmer and communications specialist, and Dr. Lena Hale, a geologist and expert in deep-sea fauna, whose task was more research-oriented than technical. Climbing out of the capsule, Aris smelled the familiar mix of ozone from operating electronics, sterile filtered air, and a faint metallic tang. The module was cramped but functional. A living compartment, a laboratory, a control center, a small galley. The portholes were small, tens of centimeters thick, but even through them, only an impenetrable inky darkness was visible, occasionally pierced by the beams of Hydra's external floodlights. All systems nominal, doc. Kenji's voice, slightly muffled by the intercom, pulled Aris from his thoughts. Yes, Kenji. Pressure stable. Commencing demothballing of primary equipment. The last time Aris had been at such a depth was 2 years ago. That expedition had ended in tragedy. His friend and partner, Michael, had died due to a rebreather failure during an open water excursion. The memory hit suddenly, a cold wave, and Aris swallowed hard. He had undergone psychological rehabilitation, been cleared for work. But Michael's ghost sometimes returned, especially here in the crushing silence of the deep. He had to focus. The first few days were routine, checking Hydra systems, calibrating sensors, preparing remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, for the initial inspection of Oceanos 1. The platform was heavily damaged, but the main hull seemed to have maintained integrity in some sections. That offered hope. On the fourth day, they began the most complex part of the first phase, attempting to power some of Oceanos' systems from Hydra to access its onboard computers. Aris personally supervised the connection of power cables using ROV manipulators. It was meticulous work in complete darkness, illuminated only by the robot's lights. Finally, the first indicators lit up on Hydra's central console. Power was flowing to Oceanos. "We have contact," Kenji exclaimed excitedly, stabilizing voltage, attempting to access primary diagnostic modules. Aris watched the readings intently. Beside him, Lena, having set aside her sediment samples, also watched with interest. Hydra's control center had several dozen screens, most now displaying telemetry data, schematics, or images from ROV cameras clinging to the sunken station's hull. It was at that moment that one of the auxiliary video surveillance screens, previously dark and inactive, suddenly flickered with a soft bluish light. Aris didn't immediately notice it, absorbed by the data stream from Oceanos. But there was something wrong about that glow. The screen wasn't displaying a standard splash screen or error message. It was showing an image. Clear, stable. It was a cabin. Small, almost empty. A modest bunk. A table bolted to the floor. A single porthole. And outside the porthole, Aris felt a chill run down his spine. Outside the porthole was the surface of the ocean, bright sunlight glinting on a light ripple of waves, a blue, boundless sky, a video feed that couldn't exist. Chapter 2, The Impossible Image. "What is that?" Lena was the first to break the silence, her voice full of bewilderment. She pointed a finger at the glowing screen. Aris slowly turned his head. Kenji, looking up from the main console, also stared at the screen with a bewildered expression. Some kind of test pattern? He guessed uncertainly. Maybe from Oceanos' old systems. Something activated when we supplied power. Aris moved closer. The image was crystal clear, without interference. No signs of an old recording. The movement of the waves outside the porthole was smooth, natural. Light clouds drifted lazily across the sky. It was a live feed. But from where? That's not Oceanos. Aris shook his head, his analytical mind frantically searching for an explanation. The architecture is different. The portholes on Oceanos were round and smaller. And besides, he pointed to the view outside. We're at a depth of 6 kilometers. There can't be sunlight and a surface here. Maybe it's an error in the video signal switching matrix. Kenji was already typing furiously, bringing up diagnostic programs. Crosstalk from one of our external communication channels with Poseidon? Impossible. Aris cut him off. First, the channel to Poseidon is currently transmitting only telemetry, no video of this quality. Second, even if it were an error, where is this image coming from? Which camera? We don't have cameras pointed at the surface from inside some unknown cabin. He examined the screen carefully. The cabin was Spartan. Metal furniture, painted grey. No personal belongings. Absolutely sterile. And empty. No one. Signal source ID. Aris asked, his eyes still fixed on the screen. Kenji frowned, scanning the logs. No, nothing. This video stream isn't passing through standard multiplexers. It's as if it materialized directly on this screen. The system sees it as a local source, but physically there's no such input. Aris felt goosebumps crawl up his skin. He was used to equipment failures, malfunctions, the most incredible technical problems. But this was beyond his experience. This was impossible. Try to turn it off, he ordered. Kenji tried. Neither a software shutdown of the screen, nor an attempt to reassign the video input yielded any results. The image remained. Calm, serene, and utterly absurd in their current situation. Physically cut power to the monitor itself. Lena suggested. That's a last resort. Aris rubbed his temples. It's tied into the main power bus of the diagnostic PAL. I'd rather not damage anything right now. Let's try to figure this out first. He looked at the cabin again. The sense of unreality was growing. As if someone was playing a trick on them, broadcasting this image specifically for them. But who and how? Maybe it's some kind of deep-sea hallucination. Lena chuckled nervously. A collective one. We're supposed to be protected from nitrogen narcosis. Pressure is normal, air composition too. Aris checked the readouts on his wristband. This isn't physiological. He remembered the rumors about Oceano's one, not just a technical catastrophe. They spoke of strange signals the station had received shortly before its demise, of psychological breakdowns among the crew. Back then, he had dismissed it as idle speculation. Now, Kenji, check all external sensors. Any anomalous readings, magnetic field, radiation levels, acoustic signals. Lena, have you noticed anything unusual in the sediment samples or the behavior of deep-sea organisms that appeared on the ROV cameras? Both shook their heads. Everything's standard, Doc. Nothing out of the ordinary, Kenji replied. Typical abyssal fauna, and no anomalies in the geology, Lena confirmed, though her voice held a note of anxiety. Aris stared at the screen again. Some light on the waves. It was so normal. And that normality, broadcast into the heart of the impenetrable abyss, was what made it truly terrifying. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered slightly, not interference, but as if the camera transmitting it had swayed a little. Aris held his breath. Then, in the far corner of the empty cabin, on the metal wall, a shadow appeared. Indistinct, blurry, but definitely a shadow of something or someone outside the frame. The shadow slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to shift. Chapter 3. Voice from nowhere. The shadow on the wall froze, as if listening. Aris, Kenji, and Lena, as if on command, also froze, afraid to startle. What? The image? A ghost in the machine? Do you see that? Lena whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. We see it, Aris answered hoarsely. His heart was pounding somewhere in his throat. Logic refused to accept what was happening, but his eyes weren't deceiving him. The shadow remained motionless for several long seconds, then slowly, very slowly, began to retreat until it completely disappeared. The cabin was empty again, but the feeling of someone's unseen presence there, beyond the porthole with its view of the sunlit ocean, became almost palpable. That can't be a recording. Kenji shook his head, his face pale. It's reacting. It's as if it knows we're watching. This thought was so wild that Aris felt dizzy. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. Kenji, are you sure there are no external signatures? No traces of a hack into our systems? Maybe it's some sophisticated virus brought in with data from Oceanos. I've checked everything, Doc. Network activity is zero, apart from our standard exchange with Poseidon. Oceanos' systems are only outputting primary telemetry so far. We haven't loaded any executable code from there. This is something else. Aris walked around the console, approaching the ill-fated screen. He carefully examined the details of the cabin. The metal of the walls, the rough weld seams, the simple design of the porthole. Nothing remarkable. But there was something sinister in its simplicity, as if it were a set specially created for them. Try to record this video stream, Aris ordered, and all system logs related to this screen. We need proof. If we report a talking picture to Poseidon, they'll just laugh at us. Already on it, Kenji bent over the keyboard again. But I'm not sure standard capture tools will work. This signal is bypassing all protocols. Time passed. The sun on the screen slowly dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky and water in warm orange-pink hues. Sunset. There, in that impossible cabin, evening was falling. Here, at a depth of 6 kilometers, there was only eternal night. Lena brought them hot coffee. No one wanted to be away from the screen for long. The silent observation of a foreign, unreal reality had become their obsession. Suddenly, a quiet crackle came from the speakers, which usually broadcast the sounds of ROV operations or communication with Poseidon. Then, a barely audible whisper. All three froze. The whisper was indecipherable, as if someone was speaking from a great distance or in an unknown language. It contained hissing, clicking sounds. What is that? Aris turned sharply to Kenji. I don't know. Kenji frantically checked the audio system. Source unidentified. These aren't our channels. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It didn't sound like human speech. It had no intonation, only a monotonous, rhythmic murmuring that sent shivers down their spines. Aris felt nausea rise in his throat. This was no longer just a strange image. This was something trying to contact them, or to penetrate. "Cut the sound," he shouted, immediately. Kenji slammed a key, and the eerie whisper stopped. In the ensuing silence, only their heavy breathing could be heard. It was speaking, Lena muttered, pressing her hands to her mouth. "But what?" "I don't know." Aris tried to remain calm, though he felt a chill deep inside. "But it's definitely connected to this screen." He looked at the image again. The sunset was almost over. Twilight was gathering in the cabin, and in that twilight, by the porthole, Aris noticed something new. A thin, barely visible silhouette. Very tall, disproportionately thin. It stood with its back to them, looking at the fading sunset over the ocean. The figure didn't move, but its very presence radiated an unspeakable dread. There's someone there." Aris's voice was barely audible. Kenji and Lina saw it too. Fear, which until then had been only an unpleasant premonition, now took on an almost physical form. And then the figure slowly, very slowly, began to turn. Chapter 4. Ghosts of Oceanos. The figure on the screen turned with an unnatural, almost doll-like smoothness. The twilight in the cabin deepened, obscuring details, but Aris could see long, thin limbs and a disproportionately small head. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. He couldn't look away, though his entire being screamed of danger. When the figure had turned enough for its outline to be discernible in the semi-darkness, Aris felt his blood run cold. There was no face, or it was so alien, so inhuman, that his brain refused to perceive it, leaving only a blurry, dark patch in its place. At that moment, Kenji, unable to bear the tension, slammed his fist on the emergency power cutoff panel for the diagnostic monitor section. The screen broadcasting the nightmarish cabin went dark, plunging the control center into relative gloom, illuminated only by the main work displays. For a few seconds, a deafening silence reigned. "What was that?" Lena breathed out, her voice trembling. "I don't know." Aris wiped his face with his hand. It was damp with cold sweat. "But I no longer believe in technical malfunctions. We need to report to Poseidon immediately," Kenji said quickly, his usual composure gone. "This is an emergency. Critical." "And what will we tell them?" Aris chuckled bitterly. That a window to another reality appeared on our monitor, and something was looking at us from it. "They'll evacuate us immediately, shut down the project, and send us for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." He knew corporate protocols. Any mention of the inexplicable, anything outside the bounds of strict science, was taboo. It threatened not only careers but reputations. "But we can't just ignore this," Kenji exclaimed. "It tried to talk to us. It saw us." "I know," Aris nodded, "but we need facts. Proof. Did you manage to record the video stream?" Kenji looked doubtfully at his console. "Partially. But the quality, the system resisted. And the sound? I'm not sure it recorded correctly. We need to try to recover data from Oceanos," Aris decided. "Maybe there are answers there. That crew, they might have encountered this too." Their silence. "It's not just a technical malfunction. I'm almost sure of it now. But if they encountered this and died?" Lena shivered. "We risk repeating their fate." "We do," Aris agreed. "But sitting idly by and waiting for it to reappear is even worse. We have an advantage. We know something is wrong here. They might have been caught off guard." He remembered his first dive after Michael's death. Nightmares had plagued him then, doubts about his own sanity. He had feared he wouldn't be able to work at depth again, but he had overcome it. This fear, irrational, primal, was similar to that old one, but now it was more real. The next few hours were spent in a frenzy of activity. Kenji tried to extract and decrypt data from the half-dead storage media of Oceanos 1. Aris, using an ROV, conducted a more detailed inspection of the sunken station's outer hull, looking for any anomalies that might explain the strange video signal. Lena, despite her fear, helped Kenji using her data analysis skills to sort information. Finally, Kenji managed to recover a few fragments of the logbook of Captain Arthur Grayson of Oceanos 1. The entries were fragmented, heavily damaged. Day 47. Strange interference on VLF. Unlike natural noise. Crew complaining of headaches and insomnia. Day 51. Professor Elias claims it's a structured signal. Decryption attempts unsuccessful so far. Observing increased irritability among crew. Day 55. The image. On one of the screens. Impossible. From where? It's watching. Elias says it's a window. A window to the wrong place. Day 58. Voices. They're everywhere. In the walls. In the water. In my head. We are not alone here. It once. The last available entry was short and terrifying. Day 60. It's here. Do not open. Then, silence. Aris felt a chill run down his spine again. Their situation was frighteningly similar to the one Captain Grayson had described. A window. Voices. It's watching. They saw the same thing, Lena whispered, her face as white as a sheet. And it killed them. Perhaps Aris frowned. But what exactly is it? And what does do not open mean? He looked at the dark screen where the window to another reality had recently been. Could it turn on again? Was cutting the power enough? Suddenly, one of the ROVs working near the hull of Oceanos transmitted a strange image. The camera, aimed at one of the sunken station's portholes, had captured a faint, intermittent glow from within, as if someone inside the dead, flooded station had turned on a flashlight. What the hell? Aris zoomed in on the image. There shouldn't be any light there. All systems are powered down, except what we supplied. The glow flickered a few times, then became steadier. It emanated from the depths of one of Oceanos' laboratory sections. Maybe it's residual luminescence from some chemical reagents. Lena suggested. Too bright and focused. Aris shook his head. Kenji, can you send an ROV with a more powerful camera and sensors there? While Kenji maneuvered the robot, Aris thought again about Grayson's entries. A window to the wrong place. Where was the wrong place? Another dimension. Another universe? And why had it appeared here, near Oceanos? Was the station built in the wrong place? Or had its activities provoked something? The ROV approached the porthole. The light from within grew brighter, and then the camera focused. Behind the thick, sediment-covered glass of Oceanos 1's porthole, Aris saw a face. Distorted, swollen from the water, but still recognizable. The face of a man in an old-style diving suit. His eyes were empty, wide open, and they were staring directly at the ROV's camera. And behind him, in the depths of the flooded compartment, other dark figures swayed. Chapter 5. Echo in the Machine. The sight was so gruesome that Aris involuntarily recoiled from the screen. The face in Oceanos' porthole was motionless, but its very presence there, in a sealed compartment of the sunken station, where there should have been nothing but water and rusting metal, evoked a primal terror. That's impossible, Kenji stammered. How are there people? Those aren't people, Lena said quietly, her voice tense. Not living ones anyway. Aris forced himself to look at the screen again. The figures behind the first observer were blurry, but there were several of them. They seemed to sway in time with invisible underwater currents inside the station. They haven't decomposed. Aris frowned, trying to think rationally despite the rising panic. After 50 years at this depth, the deep sea environment, low temperatures, lack of oxygen in sealed compartments can slow decomposition, Lena explained, but her voice sounded unsure. But to this extent, and why are they there, at the porthole? As if, waiting, or guarding, Aris added grimly. Remember Grayson's last entry? Do not open. Maybe he meant the station. Suddenly, the image from the ROV jerked violently, and static filled the screen. What happened? Aris asked. Lost contact with ROV 3. Kenji typed rapidly, trying to re-establish. No, the signal is gone completely. As if it was. Cut. Aris went cold. Is there something out there capable of damaging an ROV? He remembered stories of giant squid and other little studied inhabitants of the deep. but so suddenly and without a trace. Could the window be connected to Oceano's not just informationally, but physically? Lena suggested, what we saw on the screen, can it project or influence objects here? This thought was even more unsettling. If that entity, that observer from the impossible cabin, could not only show them pictures but also interact with their equipment, with their reality. Suddenly, all the screens in Hydra VI's control center flickered and went dark. For a few seconds, complete darkness reigned, broken only by faint emergency lighting. The life support systems continued to hum, but all other equipment was off. Main power failure, Kenji shouted. Switching to reserve batteries, what's happening? Aris felt his stomach drop. This didn't feel like a normal malfunction. This was a targeted shutdown. Reserve power kicked in, but only partially. The main consoles remained dark. Only life support and one small service monitor, usually showing the airlock status, were working, and that monitor suddenly came to life. It wasn't showing the sunlit cabin. It was showing something else. A grainy, black and white image, as if from an old surveillance camera. It was one of Hydra VI's corridors, the corridor leading to the living quarters. And down that corridor, a dark, tall figure was moving slowly, the same one they had seen on the window screen. It's here, Lena whispered, her voice breaking with terror. It's inside the module. Aris froze. Impossible. The airlock was sealed. All external hatches were closed. Nothing could have gotten inside. But the figure on the screen was real. It moved with that same unnatural smoothness, its proportions distorted, and a dark patch where its face should have been. Kenji, lock the doors to the control center. Now. Aris commanded, his voice tense but firm. Kenji, with trembling hands, tried to activate the locking system. The indicators on the panel flashed red several times, then went dark. It's not working. Despair laced his voice. The system isn't responding. It's controlling the systems. Aris looked around. The control center was a small room. One exit leading to the corridor where it now was. There was nowhere to run. A sound. A quiet, scraping sound. It came from the corridor. It was approaching. Aris grabbed a heavy wrench from the tool panel. A weak weapon against the unknown, but it was better than nothing. Lena cowered in a corner, covering her face with her hands. Kenji stood frozen by the console, his gaze fixed on the door. The scraping grew louder. Then a dull thud against the door. Then another harder. The metal door bulged slightly inwards. This creature, or whatever it was, possessed immense strength. It once in, Aris muttered, gripping the wrench tighter. Adrenaline surged through his blood, mixed with icy fear. He remembered Michael. He hadn't been able to do anything then. Now, at least he would try. Suddenly, the blows stopped. Silence fell, as oppressive as at the very beginning of their dive. Aris, Lena, and Kenji held their breath. What next? And then, a voice came from the intercom speakers, which also seemed to be off. Quiet, distorted, but surprisingly familiar. Aris, can you hear me? Aris froze. That voice? He knew that voice. Michael, he whispered, unable to believe his ears. Chapter 6. The Lie of the Deep. Michael's voice. It couldn't be. Michael had died 2 years ago. Aris himself had seen his body, participated in the investigation, but the voice that came from Hydra VI's intercom speakers was terrifyingly similar. The same timbre, the same familiar intonations, though distorted by static and a strange gurgling echo. Aris, I'm here. Help me. The voice came again, full of suffering and pleading. Lena and Kenji looked at Aris with horror and disbelief. Doc, that's not him, Kenji whispered. It's some kind of trap. It's playing with us. Aris knew it. Intellectually, he understood it was impossible. But his heart ached with pain and a kind of mad, desperate hope. What if? Michael, where are you? He asked, his own voice trembling. I'm trapped. It's dark here, and cold. Please, Aris, open the door. The door to the control center. The same door the unknown creature had been trying to break down just minutes ago. It's a lie, Aris. Lena jumped to her feet, her eyes blazing with fear and anger. It's trying to make you open it. Don't listen to it. But Michael's voice continued, appealing to his deepest fears and guilt. Guilt for not being able to save his friend. You promised we'd always have each other's backs. Remember, Aris? Aris closed his eyes. Memories flooded back with renewed force. Their dives together, laughter, plans for the future, and that last day. The system failure, Michael's panic, his own desperate but futile attempts to help. I can't, Mike, Aris whispered. That's not you. It is me, Aris. I'm begging you. I'm so scared. It's here with me. Genuine terror tinged the voice. Aris clenched his teeth. This was a cruel, sophisticated torture, using his most vulnerable spot, his unhealed wound. If you're Michael, Aris forced himself to speak loudly and clearly. Tell me, what were we going to do after that expedition? Our secret plan. Silence filled the speakers, only the crackle of static. Our plan? Michael's voice sounded confused. We were going to celebrate. Wrong. Aris snapped. His heart still ached, but reason was beginning to take over. We were going to open a small dive equipment repair shop on the coast of Costa Rica. You always dreamed of surfing. Silence. And then, a sound came from the speakers that made the hair on Aris's neck stand on end. It wasn't Michael's voice. It was a low, guttural laugh, devoid of all human warmth. A laugh that seemed to emanate from the abyss itself. Clever boy, rumbled an unfamiliar, inhuman voice full of mockery. And then, silence again. Aris breathed heavily. The deception was revealed, but there was no relief. Only greater fear. This entity wasn't just strong, it was intelligent and incredibly cruel. What now? Kenji looked at Aris with hope. Aris surveyed the control center. They were trapped. Main systems were down. No communication with Poseidon. And something hostile was right outside the door, controlling their module. We need to regain at least some control, Aris decided. Kenji, is there any way to bypass the lockout and access the systems directly? Through service ports. Maybe there's a manual override. Kenji thought. Possibly. Hydras have an emergency manual control system for main functions, but it requires physical access to the main distribution panel. It's located in the technical bay. Beyond that door. It was a vicious circle. To get out, they had to pass what had trapped them. Lena, do you know anything about the nature of such entities? Aris looked at the geologist. In folklore, in myths, is there anything similar? Beings from other dimensions, capable of mimicking voices, penetrating minds. Lena shook her head. I'm a geologist, Aris, not a paranormal specialist. But what we saw on the screen, what tried to speak with Michael's voice, it doesn't fit into any known scientific framework. It's something ancient, something that shouldn't have awakened. Ancient. That word stuck in Aris's mind. Captain Grayson and his crew on Oceanos had also encountered something they couldn't explain, and it had destroyed them. Suddenly, the service monitor showing the corridor flickered again. The image changed. Now the camera wasn't showing the corridor, but that same empty cabin with the view of the sunlit ocean. The window had opened again, but now it wasn't empty. At the porthole, with its back to them, stood the same tall, thin figure. It slowly turned its head, and Aris again saw that dark, indistinct patch instead of a face. Then the figure raised a hand, long, with fingers as thin as branches, and pointed, not at them, but at something inside the cabin. The camera slowly shifted focus, following its gesture, and showed the table bolted to the floor. On the table lay an object, small, dark, of an unidentifiable shape. And then a voice came from the speakers again, not Michael's, not the mocking laughter, but that same indecipherable, hissing whisper they had heard before. But now it was louder, more insistent, and Aris suddenly understood. These weren't just sounds. These were coordinates, numbers, sequences. Chapter 7, Call of the Abyss. Coordinates. The whisper emanating from the speakers now seemed to Aris not just a meaningless collection of sounds, but a stream of data. He didn't understand the language, if it even was a language, but he intuitively felt this was information. And the figure on the screen was pointing at the object on the table as if it were a key. It's transmitting something. Kenji sensed it too. I can try to record and analyze this audio stream. Maybe I can extract some patterns, mathematical sequences. Do it, Aris nodded, and I'll try to figure out what that object is. He looked at the image again. The object on the table was small, about the size of an adult's fist. Its shape was irregular, asymmetrical, with many facets and protrusions. The color, dark gray, almost black, with some lighter veins, resembling frozen lightning. It didn't look like any mineral or artifact he knew. Lena, does this mean anything to you? Aris asked. Lena moved closer to the screen, peering intently. It's hard to say. It looks like some kind of crystal or a rock fragment of a very unusual structure. But I've never seen anything like it. Those veins, they seem to glow faintly from within. The figure on the screen remained motionless, its pointing gesture insistent. It wants us to find it, Aris said. But where? Here on Oceanos, or somewhere else? The whispering continued, monotonous and mesmerizing. Kenji had already connected a spectrum analyzer to the audio output and was trying to visualize the sound waves. Got it, he exclaimed after a while, repeating patterns. This is definitely not random noise. I'll try to convert them into numerical values. While Kenji worked, Aris kept his eyes on the screen. What was this place? Why was it so important to this entity, and why had it chosen them? The thought that this creature might not be simply hostile, but pursuing some incomprehensible goals of its own, was even more frightening. Blind aggression would have been simpler, but here there was a sense of some sinister, unfathomable design. Suddenly, the image on the screen changed again. The cabin with the figure disappeared. In its place, another image appeared, much more familiar and therefore even more terrifying. It was one of Oceanos One's laboratories, the same one where they had seen the face in the porthole, but now the camera was showing it from the inside. A flooded room covered in rust and silt, equipment, instruments, all twisted and broken. And amidst all this chaos, those same dark, swollen figures of former crew members. They moved slowly, swaying in the water, their empty eyes fixed on a single point, the center of the laboratory. There on the floor, among the debris, lay an object identical to the one they had seen on the table in the impossible cabin. Dark, faceted, with glowing veins. It's there, Lena whispered, on Oceanos. And those? Aris struggled to find the word. Are they guarding it? Looks like it. Kenji tore himself away from his work. I've decrypted part of the sequences. They are indeed coordinates. And they point to that very laboratory section of Oceanos One, accurate to the meter. So the entity wanted them to retrieve this artifact. But why? And what would happen if they did? Or if they refused? This could be a trap, Aris said, though he wasn't sure himself. It's luring us there. Or is this the only way to negotiate? Lena suggested. Maybe this object is the key to making it leave us alone. Doubtful. A creature capable of penetrating their systems, mimicking the voices of the dead, and conjuring visions from other realities hardly needed to negotiate with three people trapped in an underwater module. More likely, it was using them as tools. We can't go there, Kenji shook his head. It's suicide. We saw what's there, and we don't know what else this thing is capable of. But we can't stay here either, Aris countered. Sooner or later, it will find a way to get in here. Or our life support systems will fail completely. We're trapped. He looked at his hands. They were trembling slightly. Fear mingled with a strange, almost morbid curiosity. What was this artifact? What power did it hold? And what was the nature of the entity that so insistently demanded it? It felt like the call of the abyss, dangerous yet alluring. We have ROVs, Aris said after a long silence. One should still be operational. We can try to retrieve this object remotely. And if it attacks it again? Kenji asked. We lost ROV-3 right there. Then we'll know that path is closed, Aris shrugged. But we have to try. If this artifact is so important to it, perhaps by obtaining it, we can change something. Maybe even close this window. It was a faint hope, but it was all they had. Preparing ROV-2 took some time. All systems had to be checked. Manipulators confirmed operational. Aris took control. He was the best ROV pilot on the team. The image from the robot's camera appeared on the screen. grim, lifeless seascapes illuminated by the floodlight beams. The ROV slowly approached the damaged hull of Oceanos 1. Aris felt the tension build. Every creak, every rustle transmitted through the ROV's hydrophones made him jump. There was the porthole, the same one where they had seen the face. Now, only darkness lay behind it. Trying to find a way in, Aris commented on his actions. The hull is badly damaged. There might be a breach. He maneuvered the ROV along the hull, examining every dent, every crack. And then he found it. A jagged hole in the plating, large enough for the ROV to squeeze through, right next to the laboratory section. Going in, Aris said, and guided the robot into the darkness of the sunken station. The camera transmitted images from inside, corridors littered with debris, rust, silt, gloom, and silence. The eerie, oppressive silence of a dead ship. The ROV slowly advanced towards the laboratory, and there they saw them again. The shadows. The figures of former crew members. They were there in the laboratory, standing motionless around something hidden from the camera. Aris made the ROV approach. The floodlight beam snatched the artifact from the darkness, lying on the floor. It did indeed glow faintly from within, emitting an uneven, pulsating light. "I see it," Aris said. "I'll try to grab it with the manipulator." He carefully guided the manipulator towards the artifact. The figures didn't react. They just stood there like eerie, silent sentinels. The manipulator touched the artifact. And at that moment, all the figures simultaneously turned their heads and stared with their empty eye sockets directly at the ROV's camera. And from the speakers, that hissing, inhuman whisper sounded again. But now it wasn't just insistent. It was furious. Chapter 8. The Touch of the Other. When the ROV's manipulator touched the dark, faceted artifact, Aris's world momentarily froze. The whisper in the speakers escalated into a deafening, multi-vocal roar that made their ears pop. The image from the robot's camera twitched, covered in a ripple of static. The figures of the former Oceanos crew, previously motionless, began to move. They advanced slowly but inexorably towards the ROV, their swollen hands reaching out. "They're attacking," Kenji yelled. "Get the robot out, Doc." Aris frantically tried to control the manipulator to get a firm grip on the artifact while simultaneously trying to steer the ROV away from the approaching figures. But the robot's movements became sluggish, delayed, as if some invisible force was resisting him. "I can't," Aris rasped. "It's not responding. Systems are failing." On the ROV screen, one of the figures drew close. Its bloated, distorted face filled the entire frame. Empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly into Aris's soul. Then, a sharp impact. The image vanished. Contact with ROV2 was lost. Lost another one. Kenji slammed his fist on the console in despair. They wouldn't let us take it. Tense silence descended again in Hydrovulai's control center, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 3 occupants. The plan had failed. Not only had they not retrieved the artifact, but they had also lost their last remotely operated vehicle. Now they were completely blind and helpless outside their module. Aris leaned back in his chair, feeling his strength leave him. Hopelessness washed over him like an icy wave. They had tried, and they had failed. What now? Wait until this thing finally drove them mad or destroyed the module. Suddenly, the service monitor, which had been showing a static image of Oceanos' laboratory section, flickered back to life. The same impossible cabin with the view of the sunlit ocean reappeared. And the figure. It stood by the porthole, turned away from them. Then it slowly turned. The dark patch instead of a face. And again that same pointing gesture at the table where the artifact lay. But this time, something was different. The artifact on the table in the cabin glowed brighter, and the image itself became clearer, more three-dimensional, as if the window had moved closer. And then, a single distinct sound came from the speakers. Not a whisper, not a roar. A click, like someone unlocking a door. Aris, Lena, and Kenji exchanged glances. What did that mean? And then they felt it. A slight draft. In a sealed underwater module at a depth of 6 kilometers. A draft. Aris slowly turned his head towards the control center door. The same door they had tried to lock. A gap. A narrow but noticeable gap between the door and the frame. The door wasn't locked. It was ajar. And a chill emanated from that gap, not just the cold of the surrounding water, but a different, profound, otherworldly cold. It opened the door, Lena whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The figure on the window screen made a barely perceptible movement, like a nod, and pointed again at the artifact on the table. It wants us to come for it. Aris's voice was hollow. Not there on Oceanos, but here. He pointed at the screen, at the impossible cabin. But that's just an image. Kenji couldn't believe it. We can't walk into a screen. But Aris was no longer so sure. The boundaries of reality were thinning, distorting. What had seemed absurd yesterday was becoming a frightening possibility today. It opened the door to our module, Aris said slowly. Maybe it opened another door too. He approached the screen. The image of the cabin was incredibly realistic. It seemed one could reach out and touch the metal wall or the glass of the porthole. A smell. Aris detected a faint, barely perceptible odor. Saltwater and ozone? Like after a thunderstorm. This smell didn't belong to Hydra VI. It was coming from the screen. Don't do it, Aris, Lena cried out. This is madness. But Aris wasn't listening anymore. Something was drawing him to this window. An irresistible force. A mixture of fear, despair, and some perverted hope that beyond this boundary lay an answer, or at least an escape. He reached out his hand towards the screen. His fingers touched the cold, smooth surface of the glass. And suddenly, the glass beneath his fingers yielded. It became soft, pliable, like the surface of water. Aris froze, his heart stopping. Slowly, with incredible effort, he pushed his hand through the screen. Cold, not water, but something else. An indescribable sensation of emptiness, a vacuum that enveloped his hand. He looked at his hand. It was there, in the cabin. His hand, in the glove of his work suit, lay on the metal table, next to the dark, faceted artifact. It was impossible, but it was happening. The figure in the cabin slowly extended its thin, inhuman hand and touched his fingers. The touch was icy, but not physically. It was the cold of another space, another logic. And at that moment, Aris felt something. Not thoughts, not words, but a flood of images, sensations, knowledge. A colossal, incomprehensible volume of information surged into his consciousness. He saw galaxies being born and dying, civilizations flourishing and vanishing in the blink of an eye, beings woven from light and darkness whose thoughts were the laws of physics. And he saw this window, not one, thousands, millions, an infinite network of portals connecting worlds, times, realities. And he saw them, those who had created these windows, those who watched, ancient as the universe itself, unfathomable. The artifact, it wasn't just a stone, it was a key, a capacitor, a device for navigating this network, or for stabilizing it. And they, humans, had accidentally stumbled upon one of these windows here at the bottom of the ocean. Oceanos one, with its equipment, its signals, had unintentionally disturbed it, caused instability. And now the window was trying to correct it, using them. Aris's consciousness couldn't withstand this flood. His head was splitting with pain. He felt his mind disintegrating. He snatched his hand back. The connection broke. Aris fell to his knees, gasping for breath. The screen became just a screen again, showing a static picture of the cabin. But now Aris knew. He knew too much. Aris, what's wrong with you? Lena and Kenji rushed at him. Aris looked up at them, his eyes wild, dilated with terror and understanding. We have to, he choked out. We have to. Close it. Chapter 9. The Price of Knowledge. Close it? But how? Kenji stared at Aris in desperation. We don't know how it works. We don't even understand what it is. Aris slowly got to his feet, still trembling. The flood of information that had poured into his consciousness through the touch of that entity was overwhelming, destructive. He felt his brain struggling to process this monstrously vast knowledge. But along with the horror came a vague, intuitive understanding. The artifact, Aris rasped, pointing at the screen where the cabin with the object on the table was still visible. It's the key, but not the one on Oceanos. That one is broken, damaged. It's causing the instability. We need another one. Another one. Where are we going to get it? Lena was pale, but her voice held a note of determination. She saw that something had happened to Aris, that he had gained some knowledge, however terrifying. Aris looked at the screen again. The figure in the cabin remained motionless. The window was stable. There, he nodded at the screen. We have to get it. From there. But you just said, it's like walking into the screen. Kenji was horrified. You almost. What happened to you when you touched it? I saw. Aris struggled to find the words. It's not just a creature. It's part of a vast system, a network. They observe. Correct errors. Oceanos was an error. We are too. If we don't close this window, it will expand. It will consume everything. He couldn't explain everything he had seen. Human language was too poor for it, but he knew they had to act. If I understood correctly, Aris concentrated, trying to fish the necessary information from the chaos of his memories. That artifact on the table there, it's tuned to close this specific portal. But to activate it, it needs a human interface. He looked at his hands, at the one that had been there. Someone has to go there, take it, and use it. Silence. The realization of what Aris was proposing fell heavily on Lena and Kenji. To go there, into that impossible place, to face an inhuman entity. It was a one-way ticket. I'll go, Aris said firmly. He was an engineer. He was used to solving problems, and this problem demanded a sacrifice. Besides, he had already touched the other. He was changed. Perhaps only he could do it. No, Lena exclaimed. We can't let you. There's no other way. Aris looked her in the eyes. You have to stay here. If I succeed, the window will close. If not, you have to try to transmit everything we've learned to Poseidon. All the recordings, all the logs. Maybe someone else will find a way. He approached the screen, reached out his hand again. The surface yielded, cold and empty. Cover me, he said without turning around. And, if something goes wrong, destroy this monitor. At any cost. Maybe that will break the connection. He stepped forward and found himself there, in the cabin. The sensations were indescribable. The air was thin, smelling of ozone and something else, unfamiliar, metallic. Outside the porthole, the same unreal sun glinting on the waves. And the figure. It stood nearby, silent and motionless. Aris felt its presence, not threatening, but utterly alien. Observing. He walked to the table. The artifact lay there, faintly pulsating with an inner light. Aris picked it up. The stone was cold, but not icy. It fit perfectly in his hand. And again, a flood of information, but this time more orderly, purposeful. Instructions. He had to connect it to the window, to its source. Aris turned to the wall where he knew the portal leading back to Hydra VI was located. But it wasn't just a wall. He saw it differently now, as a shimmering membrane, vibrating with energy. He pressed the artifact against the membrane, and the world exploded with light. In Hydra VI's control center, Lena and Kenji watched in horror as Aris's figure disappeared into the screen. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen flashed with a blinding white light, so bright they had to squint. A deafening roar erupted, shaking the module's bulkheads. The light pulsed, intensified, became unbearable. The speakers emitted a roar like the agonizing scream of a dying universe. Kenji grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the table. I have to. He yelled to Lena, shouting over the noise. He said so. He swung to smash the screen. But at that moment, the light suddenly died. The roar ceased. The screen went dark, absolutely dark, as if it had never been there. Silence descended in the control center. Tense, ringing. Lena and Kenji, holding their breath, stared at the empty space on the panel. A minute passed. 2. Nothing. Then, a faint click. Indicators on the main console lit up. Slowly, one by one, Hydra VI's systems came back to life. The fans started. The lighting was restored. Power, Kenji whispered. Main power is restoring. They rushed to the console. All systems were returning to normal. Communication with Poseidon established. A weak but stable signal. and then they heard a sound at the door. A quiet groan. Lena and Kenji exchanged glances. Slowly, cautiously, Kenji approached the door and pushed it. The door opened easily. In the corridor, crumpled on the floor, lay Aris. He was unconscious, but breathing. His face was contorted in pain, but he was alive. And in his hand, he clutched a small, dark, faceted stone. The artifact. But now it didn't glow. It was cold and dead. Chapter 10. Scars of the Abyss. The evacuation was carried out under the strictest secrecy. The official story. A critical life support system failure in Hydra VI due to an unforeseen methane release from sealed sediments, causing temporary mental impairment among the crew. Aris, Lena, and Kenji were brought to Poseidon, and from there to the mainland, to a specialized corporate medical center. Aris spent several weeks in a near catatonic state. He was silent, his gaze fixed on emptiness. Doctors diagnosed acute stress disorder and temporary amnesia. The artifact he had clutched in his hand when found was confiscated and classified by Geotech Marine's Security Service. No one could explain its origin or properties. It was just a piece of unusual stone. Lena and Kenji, though deeply traumatized by their experience, retained more clarity of mind. Their accounts of the glowing screen, the voices, and the impossible cabin were meticulously documented but dismissed as a result of oxygen deprivation and hallucinations. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. The Oceanos 1 project was immediately and permanently shut down. The area was declared a zone of high geological hazard. Gradually, Aris began to recover. Memory returned in fragments, nightmarish visions. He remembered the window, the figure, the touch, and that monstrous flood of knowledge. But now it seemed like a distant, unreal dream. He was afraid to talk about it, fearing he would be considered insane again. He was treated by the best specialists. Psychotherapy, medication. Slowly, very slowly, he began to recover. But something in him had changed forever. The world no longer seemed simple and logical. Behind familiar reality, he now sensed the presence of something else, vast and incomprehensible. An abyss that had, for a moment, shown him its edge. 6 months later, Aris was discharged. He was offered an administrative position in one of the corporation's onshore offices. No more diving. He accepted. The deep no longer beckoned him. It terrified him. Sometimes he had dreams. The summit cabin, the figure at the porthole, and whispers. Coordinates of other windows. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The knowledge he had gained was not only a burden, but also a curse. He saw the threads connecting worlds and understood how fragile the fabric of our reality was. Lena resigned from Geotech Marine. She moved to a small university town where she began teaching and studying ancient myths and legends about gods from the deep and gates to other worlds. She could no longer look at geology merely as the science of rocks. Kenji stayed with the corporation but transferred to the cybersecurity department. He became obsessed with creating impenetrable defense systems, trying to shield the world from what he now knew could infiltrate from anywhere using any technology. One day, a year after the events on Hydra VI, Aris received an anonymous package. There was no return address, only a small box wrapped in plain paper. Inside lay the artifact, the dark, faceted, cold stone. Attached was a handwritten note on a plain sheet of paper. They always return what they no longer need, but the knowledge remains. Be careful, they are still watching. There was no signature. Aris suspected who might have sent it. Someone from those who had confiscated the artifact. Someone who, perhaps, knew more than they let on. Aris stared at the stone for a long time. It no longer glowed. But Aris felt its hidden power. It was a key, and it was dangerous. He didn't know what to do with it. Destroy it? Hide it? Study it? He chose the latter. Secretly, in his small apartment, he began to research the artifact, using his engineering knowledge and the fragments of monstrous information that remained in his memory. He had to understand, at least for himself. The world continued its ordinary life. People hurried about their business, unaware of the abysses hidden behind the thin veil of familiar reality. Aris Thorne was now one of the few who knew, and this knowledge was his eternal scar left by the touch of the abyss. He often looked at the night sky, at the stars, and it seemed to him that he wasn't just seeing distant celestial bodies, but countless windows shimmering in the darkness of space. And from each window, inhuman, attentive eyes watched him. The threat had not disappeared. It had merely lurked, waited, and Aris understood that his story was not the end. It was just one of countless encounters between humanity and what lies beyond comprehension. And one day, the window from the deep might open again. Anywhere, anytime. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw that cabin again, and the figure, and felt on his hand its icy, inhuman touch, the touch of the other, and the whisper which now would forever remain with him, the whisper of the abyss.